In the dusty heart of America's highways, Golden Valley Truck Stop was the last place anyone expected a real fight. But that summer, a ruthless biker gang decided to stake their claim, and they chose the wrong man to bully. They didn't know he was a former combat medic, skilled in more than just saving lives. They didn't know how fiercely the trucking community defends one of its own. And by the time those bikers realized their mistake, Golden Valley would never be the same. A hot wind swept across cracked asphalt as a lone red Freightliner rumbled onto the gravel lot. Its driver, nicknamed Doc, carried the weight of old battles on his quiet shoulders. Folks around the truck stop simply knew him as the friendly medic who offered aid without asking for a dime in return. Yet the streaks of sunburn on his brow and the faraway look in his eyes hinted at deeper scars. If the bikers had known his past, or the lengths he'd go to protect these people, perhaps they would have turned around. But they didn't, and the stage was set for a showdown that would test loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of community. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. Golden Valley Truck Stop wasn't on the interstate maps. It was one of those places you found by chance or because some veteran driver had let slip about its surprisingly clean showers and the old-school diner that served the best chili for 200 miles. It sat off a quiet state highway sandwiched between rows of waving cornfields and a lone stretch of desert scrub. The name was a bit misleading. The land wasn't especially golden and the valley was more like a dip in the road. Still, it had character. In the sticky heat of that summer, the blacktop shimmered under the relentless sun. Drivers who rolled into Golden Valley Truck Stop typically cut their engines and sighed with relief, greeting the place like a friendly oasis. A tall weather-beaten sign, backlit by blinking yellow bulbs, stood near the entrance. It read Golden Valley Truck Stop, stay a while, friend, and was more comforting than it had any right to be, perched out there in the middle of dusty nowhere. To the east side of the truck stop rose a block of cinder and steel, forming the diner called the Roadside Spoon. Its windows faced the parking lot, allowing patrons to observe the comings and goings of rigs from all across the country. Toward the back were showers, a small lounge, and a convenience store that sold the usual suspects, chips, soda, and golden-fried burritos under a perpetually buzzing heat lamp. Attached to the building was a short hallway that led to a set of spare rooms the truck stop rented out for people who needed more than just a seat in the cab to rest for the night. Beyond the building stretched a massive parking area big enough for a dozen full-size semis, plus a smattering of passenger vehicles that rarely seemed to exceed 5 or 6 at a time. It was, all told, an unassuming place. Small enough to feel homey, big enough to house a bustling industry of cross-country hauls. Drivers came and went, forging brief alliances as they swapped stories about equipment, routes, or highway patrols. Life at Golden Valley was downright mundane until, one evening, a small band of bikers decided to roll through and stir the pot. The legendary chili and an old war story. Before we get to them, it's important to understand exactly how Golden Valley attracted so many loyal patrons. Almost every night, word spread among travelers about the Roadside Spoon's chili. The rumor was it could cure everything from heartbreak to hangovers. Some said the cook had once been an award-winning chef in Los Angeles who lost his job in a scandal. Others claimed he'd never left the building since it opened in the 1950s. Most folks simply agreed. The chili was the real deal, served in a heavy ceramic bowl that warmed both hands as you spooned out the meaty, tangy, slightly spicy concoction. If you asked for chili supreme, they'd pile shredded cheese, onions, and jalapenos high enough to feed 2 people, but no one ever walked away complaining. Late one Tuesday, the truck stop was quieter than usual. The sun had started to dip beneath the horizon, painting the sky with fierce oranges and soft magentas. A single gleaming rig pulled in, a monstrous red Freightliner that boasted polished chrome and, on the side, a modest but distinctive emblem, a pair of caduceus wings wrapped around a dagger. Those who recognized it simply referred to the driver as Document. Doc's real name was Roy "Doc" Walker. The moniker came from his tours as a combat medic for the Army, a job he'd left behind 8 years ago but had never truly escaped. Though not physically imposing at 5'10", he possessed an air of quiet composure that made people straighten up when he walked in. The lines around his eyes hinted at late nights and maybe even nightmares. But he carried himself with a rare calm, and it was that calm that caused troublemakers to give him a second glance and sometimes a third. No one in the truck stop asked too many prying questions about a fellow driver's personal life. You learned quickly that the road could be an escape, a lifeline, or both. Doc was, by all accounts, a good man to have around if someone got hurt. He'd patched up more than a few nasty cuts and bruises for drivers who took a spill or found themselves in scrapes at shady rest stops. He refused to take money for any help he gave, though folks often tried slipping him a bit of cash or paying for his meals. He always smiled, patted them on the shoulder, and said, "Pay it forward, friend." That night, after parking his rig near the back corner, Doc locked up and headed into the roadside spoon. He'd been driving for 13 hours and felt the usual aches in his shoulders. But he wore a faint smile, something about the hush of evening, the swirl of color on the horizon, and the knowledge that a hearty meal awaited inside made the day's exhaustion recede. He loved the open road, despite the dusty stops, the lonely nights, and the lingering ghosts of war in his dreams. Driving had become therapy in motion for him, forcing him to keep moving forward. The diner's door chimed overhead. No one was behind the front counter except a bored waitress named Rosie, who was probably in her mid-50s but didn't look it. She had a shock of red hair tied in a neat bun and eyes that sparked whenever she recognized a regular. She perked up when she saw Doc. "Well, I'll be," she said, pulling out a notepad as she approached. "You decided to grace us with your presence. Been a while, Roy." "Hey, Rosie," he replied, offering his usual easy grin. "Business took me elsewhere for a bit. How's it hanging?" Same old, same old. Got some fresh pot of chili. You want your usual?" He nodded eagerly. "You bet. Can't stay away from that chili for too long." Rosie scribbled the order, teased him about how skinny he looked, and disappeared to pass it along to the short order cook in the back. Doc settled into a booth near the window, gazing out at the twilight sky. Another rig rumbled in, a battered Kenworth with a missing side mirror. Its driver hopped out and walked to the convenience store area. The summer heat clung to everything, but inside the diner's air conditioner hummed pleasantly, casting a cool breeze over the empty tables. Doc let his mind wander, focusing on small details, the hum of neon lights, the scratch of a spatula on a hot grill, the faint clang of cutlery in a bus bin. He was trying not to think of a dream he'd had the night before about a dusty Afghanistan road, a shout, an explosion. Some nights the memories flooded in. The open highways gave him space to breathe, but the nights were trickier. A stranger's approach. Just then, the bell above the door jingled again. A lean man wearing a leather jacket with patches along the arms sauntered in, thick boots clomping on the diner's tiles. He had a patchy beard and eyes that scanned the room like he was looking for something or someone. Doc's gaze flicked up out of habit. Situational awareness had been drilled into him for years, and in that split second, their eyes locked. Doc gave a polite nod, the universal truck stop greeting of "We're all traveling, no trouble." The man responded with a slow grin that didn't quite reach his eyes before turning toward the counter. Rosie reappeared, took his order, and gave him a glass of water with ice. She said something about the evening special, but he just stared into the reflective surface of the diner's back wall. Doc shrugged and returned to his quiet reflection. Not everyone was chatty out here, and that was fine. But something about the man's demeanor was off, though Doc couldn't place why. Maybe it was the tension in his shoulders or the way he tapped his foot impatiently, sending slight vibrations through the stool. When Rosie brought Doc's chili, the aroma made him close his eyes in contentment. He prepared to dig in when he heard a voice next to him. "Good to see another driver," the stranger said, stepping over to Doc's booth. He didn't wait for an invitation, he slid onto the opposite bench. Doc lowered his spoon slowly, studying the man's face. "Yeah," he said simply. The newcomer's grin returned. "Sorry to barge in. Been on the road a while, you know how it is. Thought maybe we could swap stories." Doc shrugged, mostly to avoid confrontation. "Sure. I'm Carl," the man offered, extending a hand. His grip was firm. Doc noticed a tattoo on his wrist, a crude skull with some lettering he didn't recognize. "Roy. People call me Document." Carl arched an eyebrow. "Doc, huh? Old nickname from the service." Carl nodded as though he approved. Then he lowered his voice. You ever run across the Reaper's MC on your travels? The question set off a small warning bell in Doc's mind. He'd heard rumors about a biker gang calling themselves the Reapers, stories of extortion at rest stops, petty violence, and sometimes worse. But it was always secondhand. He'd never personally had trouble with them, though he'd once spotted a group of men wearing black and gray Reapers patches at a truck stop in Idaho. They struck him as the sort who thrived on intimidation. No, can't say I've run into them, Doc replied. Why? Carl's grin flickered. Oh, no reason. Just heard they've got a presence in these parts. Sometimes they like to hassle truckers. I thought maybe you'd have a story to share. Doc shrugged again. Sorry to disappoint you. Carl's eyes narrowed with mild annoyance. There was a brittle tension in the air, and for a moment Doc thought Carl might pick a fight. But then Carl drummed his fingers on the table, let out a sharp exhale, and forced a tight smile. Well, safe travels, Carl said, sliding out from the booth. Was nice chatting, document. With that, he left the diner without the meal he'd ordered. Rosie, stepping out from behind the counter, frowned in confusion as she watched him go. She approached Doc's table. That's the fastest anyone's ever left this place, she said. I didn't even charge him for the water. Doc shook his head. Odd sort of fellow. Might just be passing through. She nodded. Let's hope. We don't need trouble around here. Doc dug into his chili, the savory flavors momentarily easing his lingering unease. Meanwhile, in the parking lot. Outside, the sky was darkening rapidly. The single overhead lamp that illuminated the far edge of the parking lot cast a weak, flickering glow across the rows of trucks. Carl stood near his battered motorcycle. It wasn't a Harley, something older, with chipped black paint and a muffler that had seen better days. He pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, dialed, and lifted it to his ear. Yeah, they've got no idea, he said quietly, scanning the lot. I'll meet you back at the usual spot. Then we can discuss next steps. He listened a moment, nodding at whatever the person on the other end said. Sure. That ex-medic might be interesting. He's got a calm to him that's disconcerting. Not your average trucker, that's for damn sure. I'll keep an eye on him. With that, Carl ended the call, hopped onto his bike, and revved the engine. The roar shattered the gentle hush of dusk as he peeled out of the lot, leaving twin trails of dust in his wake. The trucking community, a tight-knit circle. Over the next few days, Golden Valley Truck Stop returned to its usual rhythm. Drivers came and went, some exchanging pleasantries, others content to fuel up quietly and catch a few hours of shut-eye. Doc lingered longer than usual. He was between contracts and had discovered the truck stop's small rooms were surprisingly comfortable. Plus, Rosie had done him a favor, setting aside a larger room that fit his modest possessions. A handful of other regulars also stayed around, Manny, an older driver with decades of experience and a laugh that echoed, Cynthia, known for her neon-dyed hair and no-nonsense attitude behind the wheel of her rig. They were the backbone of a traveling family. Manny would joke, we see each other more on the road than we see our own kin at home. And it was true. Long hauls meant forging bonds in these transitory spaces. When one of them found trouble in a far-off city, word would ripple across CB radios, text messages, and truck stop rumor mills faster than you'd believe. They took care of their own. Doc was approached a few times by other truckers who noticed the caduceus andagger emblem on his rig. He offered polite conversation, but he wasn't one to brag about his service. He had seen enough suffering to fill a lifetime and didn't relish dredging up those memories. Yet, he didn't deny help when it was needed. A sprained ankle, a bad burn from an overheated engine, Doc was always there with quick hands and a careful touch. In turn, Manny, Cynthia, and the others made sure Doc had a hot cup of coffee waiting if he came in late. They watched out for him the way a small-town community might watch out for a neighbor's kid. And though no one said it out loud, they loved hearing the stories of how he'd saved a life on some lonely road or how he'd defused a drunken brawl at another rest stop just by speaking softly and calmly. Doc was an anchor. Rumblings of trouble. And yet, small signs hinted at storm clouds on the horizon. More and more, travelers who pulled in mentioned seeing suspicious groups of bikers on the highways, seemingly prowling for easy targets. One driver, jittery and pale, claimed he'd seen the Reapers MC corner another trucker near a gas station. The trucker's cargo was rummaged through, possibly stolen. "I got the hell out of there," he confessed, wringing his baseball cap between shaky hands. "Didn't want to find out what they had planned for me?" These stories spread quickly around the lounge. Truckers might not be saints, but they shared an unspoken code of solidarity. The older ones reminded the younger crowd, "Keep your eyes open and keep your CB handy. Don't drive alone at night in certain areas, and if you see trouble, call for help." They took care of each other as best they could. Doc absorbed these tales with concern. He knew that most biker clubs were harmless, full of folks who just enjoyed the open road on two wheels. But the Reapers? The name itself carried a certain malice. He wondered if Carl was part of that group. From the little information he'd gleaned, it seemed likely. Yet Carl had vanished that night and hadn't been spotted since. Maybe it was all just rumor. Maybe the Reaper's MC was nowhere near Golden Valley and Carl had simply been passing through. Still, Doc couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. He'd learned through painful experience that trouble rarely gave you fair warning, it just showed up on your doorstep. And Golden Valley, with its friendly reputation and out-of-the-way location, was precisely the kind of place predators might see as easy prey. A fateful afternoon. It was late in the afternoon, a week after Carl's visit. The sun was scorching and the AC in the diner was working overtime. Rosie was serving plates of fries and burgers. Manny was fiddling with a salt shaker at the counter while exchanging jokes with Cynthia. Doc sat by the window, enjoying an iced tea, glancing occasionally at a laminated map he was studying. He was mapping out a new contract route that would take him through 3 states over the next 2 weeks. The door swung open and in strode 4 men in leather vests. Their boots stomped heavily against the linoleum floor. A hush fell in the diner. The group radiated a cocky arrogance that set everyone on edge. One of them, a big guy with a thick black beard, scanned the room. He tapped a finger against a patch on his vest that read Reaper's MC. There was also a rank insignia of sorts, road captain. He towered over Manny, who had the misfortune of sitting closest to the entrance. "Afternoon," Manny ventured, forcing a thin smile. The big man stared down at him. "Afternoon," he echoed, voice low. "We were wondering if any of y'all seen a certain trucker around here. Goes by Doc. Heard he's got a big red Freightliner parked somewhere near." Across the diner, Doc's eyes flicked up, meeting Manny's glance. Manny stiffened, uncertain what to say. "Doc?" "Never heard of him," Manny lied, though his voice betrayed a hint of tremor. The big biker sneered. "You sure about that?" he said, leaning in closer. "Now, my memory ain't perfect, but I recall hearing that he's some ex-medic. Good with his hands, that sort of thing." He paused, letting the implication hang. "Maybe you just need a little encouragement to remember?" Manny swallowed hard. "Don't want trouble," he muttered. "Too bad," one of the other bikers piped up, flicking his gaze around the diner. "Because trouble might just want you." Rosie, standing behind the counter, stared with growing concern. Cynthia shifted her stool slightly as if readying to intervene. The few other patrons froze in place, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. At the far booth, Doc quietly rose. He set his iced tea down with deliberate care. This was the moment he'd hoped wouldn't come, but he'd known better than to trust luck alone. The roads had taught him that trouble finds you if you stay in one spot too long. "I'm Doc," he said, stepping forward with measured calm. "Is there something I can help you with?" The tension in the room spiked. Manny shot him a worried look, silently warning him to be careful. The big biker pivoted, sizing Doc up. The 2 men looked like a mismatch. Doc wasn't small, but he lacked the imposing heft of the biker. Yet there was something about his squared shoulders and unwavering gaze that made the bigger man hesitate. Well, the biker said after a beat. "Ain't you a sight?" He glanced at his cohorts, who were already fanning out slightly, as if encircling Doc. "Let's step outside," Doc suggested, his tone level. He didn't want a scuffle in the diner. Rosie didn't deserve to have her place trashed. The big man cocked his head, grinned, and then jerked it in the direction of the door. "All right then, hero. Let's step outside." Doc could hear Manny murmuring behind him, "Godspeed, buddy," as he followed the bikers out into the blazing sunlight. He could feel the eyes of everyone inside burning into his back, but he pushed aside his nerves, focusing on the moment. Negotiations in the hot sun. Outside, the heat hit like an oven blast. The 4 bikers spread out. One leaned casually against a parked sedan, picking at a snag on his vest. Another cracked his knuckles. The big man faced Doc directly. "We've been looking for you," the big biker said. Heard you're a real do-gooder, helping folks out whenever they get hurt. That right? Doc shrugged. I don't like to see people suffer. That's all. The biker smirked. Noble. You know, my boss has an interest in guys like you. Skilled with medicine and all. I'm not looking for a job, Doc said bluntly. Oh, but see, the boss? He ain't really asking. He's more into telling. The biker's face hardened. The Reapers need a reliable medic. We get banged up sometimes in our line of work. Hard to find hospitals willing to patch bullet holes without calling the cops, you know? We figure maybe you'd like to join up, do us a favor when we need it. Doc's pulse quickened. This was worse than he'd expected. The Reapers wanted to coerce him into being some sort of patch-up man for their criminal activities. His stomach churned at the thought. He joined the army all those years ago to save lives, to help people, not to enable more violence. He took a step back, scanning the lot for potential escape routes. But these men had clearly blocked his immediate path. He squared his shoulders again, refusing to be intimidated. I'm not interested, he repeated. I can't be a part of that. A smaller biker with a wiry frame let out a sharp laugh. You think we're giving you a choice? We've got leverage, pal. Don't forget that. You spend most of your life out here, on the road, all alone. Accidents happen all the time on highways. Doc's jaw tightened. He'd faced threats before, but it never got easier. Still, the training he'd received, both military and personal, kept him outwardly calm. If you want a medic that badly, he said, look elsewhere. Or go to a hospital. I'm no good to you. The big biker's face contorted with anger. I don't think you heard me. We're done asking. Either you cooperate or we make you cooperate. We know plenty of ways to keep people in line. Doc steadied his breathing. He thought of Manny, Rosie, Cynthia, and everyone else inside the diner. In the back of his mind, he knew if he tried to fight these guys outright, innocent folks might get hurt. On the other hand, if he gave in now, the Reapers would never let him be. He needed a strategy, something that would protect the truck stop and himself. How about we talk terms, he said, stalling for time. I have to at least understand what you're asking. That seemed to appease the big man, who took a step closer, hooking his thumbs into his vest pockets. You'll come with us, meet the boss. He'll lay it all out. We do a little job run soon, some cargo needs moving without official eyes on it. We need a driver who can patch wounds if things go sideways. That's you. Doc forced a neutral expression, but inside, dread coiled like a tight spring. Cargo that needed smuggling, possibly contraband. Weapons, drugs, he didn't want to know. He just knew he had to keep these men from forcibly dragging him away now. He had to warn the others, come up with a plan. When is this meeting? Doc asked. One of the bikers barked a laugh. As soon as you get on your bike. Doc's mouth went dry. I don't ride. I've got my truck. A flicker of annoyance crossed the big biker's face. Then we'll ride to our place and you can follow in your rig. Either way, you're coming with us. They advanced a step, making their point clear. Doc knew he couldn't overpower 4 men alone without risking serious injury, and that was before factoring in the possibility of them pulling firearms. He tried not to glance toward the diner, worried that Manny or someone else might burst out, complicating the situation. Look, Doc said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'll meet your boss, but I need to tie up a few loose ends here. Let my dispatcher know I'll be offline for a bit. The big biker's eyes narrowed. You're stalling. Doc didn't deny it. I have to handle some things. Otherwise, I've got folks who'll come looking for me. You don't want that, trust me. At that moment, the diner door swung open. Manny stepped out, arms stiff at his sides. Despite the obvious terror on Manny's face, Doc admired the man's courage. Is there a problem out here? Manny asked, voice wavering but laced with concern for his friend. The big biker whipped around. No problem, old man. Stay out of this. Manny's gaze flicked to document. You sure you're all right, Doc? Doc managed a faint reassuring nod. I'm fine, Manny. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the tension. They're just inviting me somewhere. Manny's lips tightened. Well, you best be careful. Enough talk, the big biker growled, turning back to document. He reached into a vest pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. Address is here. Sundown. If you're not there, we'll come find you and your friends. His stare slid past Doc to Manny, who visibly swallowed. Doc accepted the paper, casting a quick glance at the scrawled address. He recognized the name of a small off-highway bar a few miles away. Then, without another word, the four bikers strode to their motorcycles, mounted them, and tore out of the lot in a cloud of dust and engine roars. Their exit left a heavy silence in the scorching afternoon air. Aftermath of the threat. Manny hurried over to Doc, voice trembling. "You can't do what they ask, can you?" Doc ran a hand through his hair, sweat beading at his temple. "They're giving me no choice." Rosie had stepped outside as well, wiping her hands on her apron nervously. "Maybe we should call the sheriff." Manny shook his head grimly. "Sheriff Walden is decent, but we're in the county's boondocks. Response time ain't quick. By the time he or his deputies get out here, those bikers could do serious damage, especially if they have bigger numbers. And we all know sometimes small-town cops get intimidated by well-connected biker gangs." Doc hated to admit Manny was right. He stared at the piece of paper with the address. The Reapers were likely more organized and dangerous than the local law could handle alone. If Doc involved the authorities without a solid plan, that might provoke an immediate and violent retaliation. He couldn't risk innocents being caught in the crossfire. "I'll go meet them," Doc finally said, voice shaking with determination. "But I'm not going alone. I need to see if I can gather some help discreetly." Manny's features flickered with worry. "Who do you have in mind?" Doc squared his shoulders. "The trucking community is bigger than just those of us parked here. I know folks who've got friends in surprising places. Allies from my old life. We'll figure something out." Rosie laid a trembling hand on his arm. "Be careful, document. Those men aren't fooling around." He nodded, meeting her gaze with steel in his eyes. "Neither am I." Deep down, Doc felt a familiar stir, a vestige of the soldier he used to be. He'd left the army because he was tired of the violence, the fear, the constant edges. But now it seemed that trouble had found him again. He couldn't run from it, not without risking harm to people he cared about. So he took a breath, tapped into that piece of himself he'd tried to bury, and prepared for whatever lay ahead. That night, as he hunched over the small table in his rented room, phone in hand, planning his next move, the words echoed in his mind. They didn't know who they were messing with. He only hoped it would be enough to keep everyone safe. The scorching sun was nearly gone, and twilight crept over the dusty expanse around the Golden Valley truck stop. Where the day's heat had once pressed down like a heavy blanket, an evening wind now stirred up small spirals of grit. A tension rippled through the place that no one could ignore. The Reapers' MC had issued a threat. If Doc Roy Walker failed to meet them by sundown, they would bring the fight straight to the folks he cared about. Inside the diner, the overhead lights buzzed softly. Rosie, her hands worrying the front of her apron, hovered behind the counter. Manny and Cynthia sat in a corner booth with Doc, the laminated table between them covered in coffee cups and scattered napkins. They were alone in the dining area. Rosie had flipped the sign on the door to closed early. She wanted no unsuspecting travelers wandering in on this kind of trouble. Doc drummed his fingers on the table. The slip of paper with the address, some local roadside bar used by the Reapers, rested near his cup. Sundown. That was all they'd said. Meet them by nightfall or suffer the consequences. "Maybe you shouldn't go," Cynthia said suddenly. Her neon green hair was pushed back behind her ears, revealing sharp cheekbones and anxious eyes. "They're trying to force you into something illegal. Or worse." Doc exhaled. "I don't want to walk into their den, but what choice do I have? If I vanish or skip town, they'll come looking for me, and they'll come here first." A grim silence settled over them. Manny rubbed his temples. "These Reapers, they're not just some ragtag bunch, are they?" Doc shook his head. "From what I've heard, they're more organized than most biker gangs. Smuggling, extortion, some of them are ex-cons or ex-military who went down a dark road. They'll do whatever they please if they think it'll keep people in line." Cynthia's jaw tightened. "Then we have to do something to protect Golden Valley." "I mean, the local police can't handle them, right?" "Not on their own," Doc agreed. "And if we call them in without a plan, the Reapers might retaliate immediately. Innocent folks could get hurt." Rosie sidled over, voice hushed. "And if you go there alone, what stops them from just grabbing you for good?" Manny snapped his fingers softly. "Doc, tell them about your idea. You mentioned calling folks from outside." Doc nodded. "I've been on the phone all afternoon making a few discreet calls. There are truckers who owe me favors, plus some connections from my army days. Not a whole brigade or anything," he added with a wry twist of his lips, "but a handful of capable people. We can coordinate a plan, something to keep me from being completely at their mercy once I show up." Rosie's eyes widened. "You can trust them?" "They're good people," Doc said firmly. "I wouldn't bring them into this if I wasn't sure. Some are already on their way or at least heading close enough to respond if things go south." He paused, glancing out the window at the deepening purple sky. "Time's almost up." Cynthia tapped her nails on the table. "What exactly are you thinking?" Doc leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I go in alone. The Reapers probably have watchers around, so if they see too many extra vehicles roll up, it'll spook them or provoke them. My friends will stay off-site but close enough that, with one call, they can be here fast. Or I can set up a signal of some sort." Manny nodded. "We can keep eyes on the roads leading in. We'll post a lookout by that old orchard behind the truck stop. That vantage point sees traffic coming from a mile away. And we have CB radios. One broadcast from you and folks will come running." Doc pressed his lips together. "That might work, but I don't want to start a war. If it's possible to deal with them without turning Golden Valley into a battleground." He trailed off. In his mind, he saw fleeting images from his army days, the crack of gunfire, dust kicked up by boots in a war zone, and the harrowing sight of wounded comrades. He'd left that life behind because he'd had his fill of violence. But circumstances were forcing him back into a mindset he despised. "I'm not a killer," he reminded himself. "I'm a medic." Yet, even as he thought it, he felt a grim acceptance settling in. Sometimes the only way to save lives was to stand up to the danger head-on. The plan takes shape. They hammered out the basics. Doc would drive his truck out to the bar at the address provided. Manny and Cynthia would stay behind at Golden Valley, keeping watch in case a second group of bikers tried to blindside them. Rosie, braver than she looked, volunteered to coordinate communications if Doc or any of his off-site allies needed to contact the truck stop. Doc's friends, some local truckers, and a few ex-military contacts would remain nearby but inconspicuous, ready to move at a moment's notice. "If you're in real trouble, you tell us," Rosie said, voice trembling only slightly. "And if you can, lure them away from the truck stop, someplace more open where fewer folks can get hurt." Doc offered her a grateful nod. "Understood." The big question hovered unsaid: what if the Reapers simply kidnap Doc or decide to kill him on the spot? None of them had a good answer. There was only the hope that the Reapers wanted him alive, at least for now. Departure. Sundown was just minutes away when Doc climbed into the cab of his red Freightliner. He double-checked his gear, ensuring he had a medical kit on hand, ironic, perhaps, considering the circumstances. He also carried a well-worn utility knife strapped to his belt. He wasn't naive enough to walk in unarmed, but he also couldn't risk showing up with a small arsenal. That would only escalate things. Manny and Cynthia stood beside Rosie, watching him from the parking lot. The older man lifted a hand in a silent salute while Cynthia flashed him a quick thumbs up. Rosie's face was creased with worry. Doc gave them a reassuring nod, started the engine, and drove off into the twilight. As he rolled along the state highway, the silhouettes of distant hills cut across the horizon. The radio was quiet, no chatter from the usual trucker channels. Doc let the silence settle into his mind, focusing on the road, forcing his breathing to stay even. The stretch of blacktop was empty, punctuated only by the reflective glow of mile markers. Up ahead, a single flickering neon sign indicated the bar's location. It was called Rusty's Pit Stop, though the sign had missing letters, so it read more like Ruthless I Stop. A few battered cars lined a gravel lot alongside several motorcycles. No big rigs. The building itself was a squat, cinder-block structure with a metal roof. Doc pulled his Freightliner off to the side, as far from the main entrance as he could manage in the narrow space. He hoped that leaving it near the road might make for a quicker getaway if things went sour. The last thing he wanted was to be trapped in a cramped lot filled with hostile bikers. He cut the engine and climbed down, the heat still radiating from the asphalt in gentle waves. Outside Rusty's Pit Stop, a single fluorescent bulb buzzed, attracting moths. Music, some old rock tune, thumped through the thin walls, occasionally drowned out by raucous laughter. Doc adjusted his ball cap, took a steadying breath, and walked in. Inside the Lion's Den, the bar's interior was dim, lit by neon beer signs and a string of dusty Christmas lights stapled around the ceiling. A haze of cigarette smoke clung to the air. At least a dozen bikers in Reaper's MC patches occupied the tables. Many of them turned to stare as Doc stepped inside. He spotted Carl first, the wiry man who had approached him at the diner earlier that week. Carl sat in a corner nursing a half-empty glass of whiskey. On the opposite side of the room was a hulking figure with a braided beard wearing a vest adorned with a large patch that read President. The boss, Doc surmised. That man was in conversation with two other Reapers, but he quickly shifted his attention to Doc's entrance. Silence fell as if a record scratch had sliced the music. One of the bikers cranked the volume down on the jukebox. Doc forced himself to move forward calmly. The braided beard man motioned him over with a slow curl of his fingers. "You're the truck driver who calls himself Doc." His voice was a low rumble that somehow carried even in the hush. Doc gave a curt nod. "That's me." The boss eyed him critically. "I'm Hackett, president of the Reaper's MC in this region." He extended a hand, not to shake but as a subtle command for Doc to hand over something, maybe a phone or a weapon. "You come here alone?" Doc placed his phone on the table. Better to appear cooperative. "I came alone. Didn't see a reason to bring an entourage." Hackett's lips twitched in a cynical half-smile. He tapped the phone, then jerked his head toward one of his men who snatched it and began scrolling through it, likely to check for any active calls or tracking. Doc said nothing. He'd expected as much. "You're smart," Hackett said. "Now, about that matter we discussed with your hosts at the diner. We have a job moving product across state lines, plus some back roads. We need a driver who knows what he's doing and can handle medical situations if they arise. You help us and maybe we don't pay a visit to Golden Valley." "Understand." Doc held Hackett's gaze. "I understand your proposition. But let's be clear, I'm not a criminal. I don't run contraband." A faint ripple of laughter ran through the assembled bikers. Hackett grunted. "Is that right? Then maybe you need a reason to reconsider. We're not giving you a choice. You either do what we say or we make an example out of that little truck stop you love so much. You wouldn't be the first medic to do patchwork for us under duress. Everyone breaks eventually." Doc's pulse hammered, but he kept his expression neutral. "What exactly are you transporting?" Hackett scratched his beard, the thick braids clinking softly with metal beads. "Guns. Some stolen, some not. You just have to drive them across the border to a buyer. Simple. We'll give you a rig if you don't want to use your own. But the job's tonight, right now, in fact." He leaned forward. "Show me you can follow orders and we'll talk about letting your truck stop off the hook. Otherwise, we burn it to the ground before sunrise." A muscle twitched in Doc's jaw. He'd been bracing for this, but the casual brutality in Hackett's words made his stomach lurch. Still, he feigned composure. "All right. Show me what I'm driving." Hackett's eyes narrowed with suspicion as though he expected more resistance. "You learn quick." "Good." He turned to the big, black-bearded biker who'd threatened Doc earlier at the diner. "Crusher, take him out back. Show him the truck. Get it loaded up." Crusher, aptly named, judging by his ham-hock arms and meaty fists, grinned nastily. He motioned for Doc to follow, taking him through a side door that led behind the bar. In the darkness, a battered box truck with mismatched tires awaited. Two more Reapers stood guard, each holding a flashlight. The lot was cramped, ringed by scraggly bushes and a dilapidated chain-link fence. Under the harsh beams of those flashlights, Doc saw crates stacked on the ground, lids partially open to reveal the dull metal of firearms. His stomach tightened. "So this is real. They're not bluffing. All this needs to be in Tucson by dawn," Crusher said, gesturing at the crates. "We'll ride escort, but you'll be alone in the cab. We clear." Doc nodded, scanning the area for any sign of cameras or watchers that might give him a chance to call for help. He spotted Carl lurking off to the side, phone in hand, likely coordinating some other Reaper movement. "They're efficient," Doc admitted grimly. "They've done this before." "Load up," Crusher barked. The two men with flashlights began hoisting crates into the back of the box truck. "You'll follow the route we give you, no deviations." Doc stepped closer, peering into the cargo space. The smell of gun oil hung thick. Despite a swirl of dread, he kept an expression of reluctant compliance. "Fine," he said, trying to sound convincingly beaten. "But if someone gets hurt on the way, I'll need to pull over to treat them." Crusher snorted. "Keep your eyes on the road and we'll keep out of trouble. Now get in. We leave in 5." Doc climbed into the driver's seat of the box truck. The interior was Spartan, just a seat, a wheel, a battered dashboard. No CB radio, naturally. No easy means of external contact. Doc's mind raced. He needed to let Manny and the others know what was happening. But how? They'd seized his phone. Maybe Manny had guessed the Reapers would try to rope Doc into an immediate run. If the watchers around Golden Valley spotted a suspicious convoy heading out, maybe that alone would trigger an alarm. He ran a hand over the gearshift. I have to buy time. On the road to nowhere. A few minutes later, Crusher rapped on the cab door. Move out. He hopped on his bike, revving it with a thunderous snarl. 2 more bikes flanked him, and a black SUV rolled out from a side parking spot. That made at least 5 Reapers in total, not counting the ones who stayed behind at the bar. Doc started the engine. It sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. As he pulled onto the main road, the bikers formed a small convoy around him, 1 up front, 2 on the sides, and the SUV bringing up the rear. They kept the pace steady, well under the speed limit. The highway was all but deserted at this hour, which suited the gang's clandestine run. Through the grimy windshield, Doc watched the moon rise over distant hills. His mind flicked through possible escape plans. If he tried to ram one of the bikes, the others would open fire. He had no doubt they were armed. If he simply drove off into the desert, the truck's lack of off-road capability might trap him in sand. The Reapers had planned every angle. Yet, Doc took comfort in one small advantage: the Reapers needed him alive, at least for the delivery. That made them somewhat cautious about provoking any crash or wild chase. They'd chosen him for his skill, both as a driver and a medic, and they wouldn't want to damage the goods. There's an opening in that, he thought. If I can stall or signal for help. As they rumbled down the lonely highway, Doc glanced at a small side mirror. The SUV's headlights glared, but he could still see silhouettes of men inside. All armed, I'm sure. He tested the brake pedal gently, noting it responded well enough. The engine might be old, but the Reapers had apparently serviced the brakes. He wondered if they'd booby-trapped anything under the dash. That might be paranoid, but from the stories, the Reapers were cunning, not sloppy. After 20 minutes, they reached a crossroads. The lead biker turned onto a smaller highway heading south. Doc's mind raced. South? That'll eventually pass near Golden Valley again. If Manny and the others are alert, they might see us. Then again, if Manny tried to intervene with only Cynthia and Rosie to back him, it would be suicide. No, Doc needed a larger ally presence, some of the folks he'd called. Meanwhile, at Golden Valley. Back at the truck stop, Manny paced anxiously in the lounge area. Cynthia was outside, peering down the road. Rosie had her phone in hand, calling every friendly contact she could think of. Any sign of them? Manny asked, pausing to stare out the window. Cynthia shook her head. No traffic for the last hour, just a pickup that fueled up and kept going. But that might mean they took a different route. Or they left earlier. She frowned. Doc was supposed to meet them at sundown. If they forced him into a run right away, they could be anywhere by now. Manny sighed heavily. We gotta trust Doc's plan. If he said he'd signal, or if something happens, we wait for a sign. Rosie finished a call and set her phone down. Jeb from up in Redwood City says he can get a small group of truckers together, but it'll take a few hours to reach us. Old Tony from the next county is on standby, too. He's got some local buddies with more security experience. Her voice quivered on the last words. Rosie had seen plenty in her years behind that diner counter, but this was different. This was war. Cynthia's face hardened. We can't just stand around. If the Reapers show up here while Doc's away, we'll have next to no defense. Manny placed a hand on her shoulder. We can hold them off for a bit. I've got a hunting rifle in my rig, and a few of the other drivers have sidearms. But if the Reapers roll in with an army, we'll need backup. They exchanged troubled glances. No one wanted violence, but it seemed all roads led there. Detour in the desert. Doc, meanwhile, continued south with his biker escort. The landscape grew more desolate, scrub brush and cacti replaced farmland, and the occasional tumbleweed skittered across the two-lane road. He checked the side mirror for the 20th time, hoping to see some sign of his allies. Nothing. Only the Reapers behind him. Up ahead, Crusher gestured with his arm, and the group took another turn, this time onto an even more remote stretch of road. The overhead power lines disappeared, replaced by open desert. The headlights cast eerie shadows on the uneven terrain. Eventually, they spotted a cluster of abandoned buildings, a forgotten roadside attraction from decades past. An old billboard, half collapsed, read Desert Dino Park, 1 mile ahead. But clearly, the place had long since shuttered. The lead biker slowed and pulled off the pavement, guiding the convoy onto a hard-packed dirt lot. With dust swirling around them, the Reapers circled the box truck. Doc braked and switched off the engine, pulses of adrenaline rolling through him. Why are we stopping here? This wasn't Tucson, and it was well short of the border. Crusher dismounted, approaching the driver's side door. He rapped on the metal. Get out. Doc complied carefully. The dust stung his eyes. What's going on? Crusher sneered. We got word the cops might be sniffing around the usual routes. So we're taking a detour. Gonna stash the cargo in these old buildings, then move again at dawn. One of the other bikers, a bald man with a jagged scar across his cheek, spat onto the ground. Means we bunk here for the night. You're not going anywhere. Doc glanced around, measuring the decaying structures. Broken windows, rusted metal sculptures of dinosaurs leaning precariously. A perfect hideout for criminals, he supposed. No cell signal. No help. This was bad. Help offload the crates, Crusher ordered. Then we'll get comfortable inside. Doc forced his shoulders to relax. If he put up a fight now, they'd likely beat him senseless or worse. He needed a better opening. Silently, he climbed into the back of the truck, passing crates one by one to the waiting bikers. Each crate was heavier than it looked, and soon his arms burned with exertion. The Reapers stacked them near a graffitied wall. When they'd finished, the boss, Hackett, arrived on his own bike, followed by Carl in the SUV. Hackett surveyed the area with a pleased grunt. This'll do. Good work, Crusher. Now let's make sure nobody strays. He eyed Document, you, truck driver. You're coming with me. Doc didn't resist as Hackett led him to one of the old buildings, a single-story structure with boarded-up windows. Inside, they found a dusty interior scattered with debris. A few battered chairs, a broken table, and a corner that had probably been a souvenir shop once. The roof was mostly intact, which was more than could be said for some of the other buildings. Hackett pointed to a spot against the far wall. Sit. Doc lowered himself onto an upturned wooden crate, trying to stay calm. Hackett towered over him, arms crossed. I don't trust you yet, Hackett said flatly. But we'll see how you behave tonight. If you cooperate, we'll all ride out in the morning and finish our deal. If not, he shrugged, letting the threat linger. Doc looked away, as though cowed, though in reality he was gauging the room. 2 men stood by the door, Crusher and Carl. A third, the bald man with the scar, lingered near the broken table. That made 4 Reapers in here with him. The rest, at least 5 or 6 more, were spread around the small compound outside. Hackett reached into his vest, pulling out a small black device, a signal jammer. He flicked it on, and a low hum began. No phone calls in or out, he said, flashing a cruel smirk. Just in case you had any ideas. Doc's heart sank. So much for covertly contacting Manny. Get comfortable, Hackett said, turning away. Carl, Crusher, you watch him. I've got things to do. Hackett stomped out of the building, leaving dust motes swirling in his wake. Carl sat heavily on a broken stool, and Crusher leaned against the wall, arms folded. The scarred man settled on the floor near the door, rifle across his lap. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the occasional shuffle of boots or the distant murmur of the other bikers outside. Night settled in fully, the temperature dropping sharply. Inside the building, stale heat lingered, making sweat bead on Doc's forehead. Seeds of doubt. Minutes passed like hours. Doc's mind spun through potential escape tactics. If I can distract them, fake an injury, maybe? That might lure them closer, give me a chance to subdue one of them quietly. But then what? 3-on-1 odds weren't good, especially with no immediate backup. He decided to probe for information. So, do you guys always do this? Strong-arm people into hauling your contraband? Crusher glowered. Shut up. Carl, however, smirked. Sometimes. There's a shortage of good drivers who can keep their mouths shut. You, on the other hand, were recommended. All those truckers singing your praises for saving them on the road. You seem soft-hearted. Easy to manipulate. Doc swallowed his retort, forcing a neutral expression. Guess you were right. Carl just chuckled. We'll see how right we are. They lapsed into silence again. Outside, a group of bikers broke into loud laughter, probably sharing a bottle of something. The Reapers were settling in for the night, comfortable in their vantage point. I have to create an opportunity, Doc thought. There's no telling what they'll do tomorrow. Even if I help them deliver these guns, they might not let me go. And if they did, the Reapers would hold the threat of returning to Golden Valley over his head. No, this had to end sooner or later. And the more time that passed, the more precarious it became for Manny and the others. He stole a glance at Carl, noticing a certain restlessness in the man's eyes. Carl kept fiddling with the phone in his hand, flipping it around, tapping it against his knee. Nervous? Why? Doc took a slow breath. Carl, right? Carl glanced over. What of it? Just remembering our chat back at Golden Valley, Doc said mildly. You seemed curious about me like you had your own reasons. Not just following Hackett's orders. Carl's mouth twitched. You're reading too much into it. But there was a flicker in his gaze that hinted otherwise. Before Doc could press further, Crusher growled, I said shut up, document unless you want me to shut you up. He tapped the holster on his belt. Doc nodded and fell silent. But he tucked that observation away. Carl had his own agenda, possibly. Maybe there was a small crack in the Reaper's armor. A risky gambit. Hours dragged on. The building grew darker, illuminated faintly by moonlight through cracks in the boarded windows. Now and then, one of the Reapers outside would stumble past, shining a flashlight in. Doc guessed that at least one was always on sentry duty. Crusher eventually pulled a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and took a deep drag. The scarred man shifted restlessly, grumbling about the dusty floor. Carl seemed lost in thought. Doc decided to try a more direct ploy, feigning distress. He let his eyes roll back slightly and slumped forward, pressing a hand to his forehead. He tensed his abdomen, forcing himself to breathe shallowly like a man in pain. Carl was the first to notice. Hey, what's with you? Doc inhaled raggedly. I feel dizzy, he mumbled. Haven't eaten, probably dehydrated. He let his shoulders sag. Crusher scoffed. Per baby. Don't get all dramatic. But the scarred man peered at Doc suspiciously. He's a medic. Could be faking. Doc slid off the crate, sinking to his knees. He made a show of retching, though only spittle came out. I'm sorry, he choked. Need water. Carl frowned. Boss wants him healthy. Hackett'd rip our heads off if we let him drop dead. He nudged Crusher. Go find some water. This place must have a faucet or something. Why me? Crusher growled. Carl rolled his eyes. Because I'm not letting him out of my sight, that's why. Go on. With an annoyed grunt, Crusher stomped out the door, leaving Carl and the scarred man alone with document. The scarred man inched closer, keeping his rifle pointed downward but ready. Doc groaned again, letting his eyelids flutter. Need sugar or I'm gonna pass out. Carl, gaze flickering with annoyance, stepped within arm's reach. One more step, Doc thought, and I can pull him down. But that rifle complicated matters, not to mention the scarred man's reflexes. Just then, Crusher returned, surprisingly quick. He tossed a half-empty bottle of water onto the floor. Found this in the SUV. Carl bent to pick it up. Here. He held it out toward Doc. Doc lunged. In a single fluid motion, he grabbed Carl's extended arm and yanked hard, swinging him around to collide with the scarred man. The rifle clattered to the ground and Doc kicked it away. Then he pivoted, hooking a leg behind Carl's knee and slamming him to the floor with a wrestling move he'd learned in the service. Crusher roared, fumbling for his own gun. Doc launched himself sideways, grabbing the broken stool and hurling it at Crusher. It smacked into Crusher's shoulder, throwing off his aim. A shot rang out, the bullet burying itself in the rotted wall. Carl cursed, grappling with document. He was wiry but strong. The scarred man scrambled, trying to retrieve his rifle, but it had skittered behind a piece of debris. Outside, shouts erupted. Footsteps pounded closer. Doc knew he had mere seconds. He clenched his fist, driving it into Carl's ribcage, forcing the air out of the man's lungs. Then he spun free and made a break for the doorway, but Crusher, recovering faster than expected, barreled into him. The impact jolted through Doc's spine as he slammed into the wall. Dazed, he tried to raise an arm to ward off Crusher's next blow, but the big man's forearm smashed across Doc's jaw. Pain exploded behind Doc's eyes. His vision blurred and he tasted blood. The world tilted and he heard Carl's horse wheezing from behind. More Reapers poured in, 2, 3, 4 men, all armed. One snatched Doc's arms, pinning them behind him. Crusher stood in front of Doc, lip curled in fury. Another punch landed in Doc's gut, doubling him over. He gasped, unable to breathe for a second. Through the haze, he heard Hackett's voice. "Stop. I said stop, damn it." Crusher halted, panting. The Reaper holding Doc jerked him upright. Hackett stood in the doorway, glaring. "What the hell is going on?" "He faked being sick," Crusher spat. "Tried to jump us." Hackett's hard eyes flicked to Doc's battered face. He sighed as though annoyed by the inconvenience. "You really are a stubborn one, document." Doc coughed, blood spattering on the floor. Not your lapdog," he managed. Hackett's jaw tightened. "Put him in the SUV. Tie him up. If he fights, break a limb. But don't kill him yet." Captive again. They manhandled Doc out into the moonlit lot. He caught a glimpse of Carl hunched over, wincing and rubbing his side where Doc had driven a fist. Crusher trudged behind, cradling his shoulder. "At least I got a few hits in." Hackett directed them to the SUV. They threw Doc into the back seat, pinning his wrists with zip ties so tight it bit into his skin. A dirty rag was shoved into his mouth to gag him. Crusher slammed the door and stood guard outside, pistol in hand. Doc groaned against the gag. He could taste copper, his jaw throbbing from the blow. Stupid move? Perhaps. But if he hadn't tried something, he'd still be inside that building, locked down. Now, the Reapers were on edge. They might slip up or overreact. And if Manny's allies were searching the roads, the commotion might give them a clue. A swirl of headlights approached. Another bike or two, maybe. Doc couldn't see much from his angle, just the fleeting glare and the shifting shadows of men striding back and forth. Shouting voices. He tried to piece together their conversation, but it was muffled by the closed SUV doors. One word cut through clearly: sheriff. Doc's heart leapt. Is the sheriff coming? Or did they spot a patrol car? If the law showed up now, it could be chaos. Still, it might be a chance. Hackett's silhouette loomed by the driver's side window. He conferred with Crusher, who was whispering rapidly. Then Hackett's voice rose, full of angry curses. Doc's pulse pounded. Maybe Manny had managed to contact the local cops after all. But would that help, or would it ignite a gunfight? Within minutes, the bikers were in motion, barking orders to load the crates back into vehicles. A few Reapers hopped on their bikes, roaring off into the desert night. Others jumped into the SUV. Doc felt the frame bounce as two men climbed into the front seats. The engine roared and the SUV lurched forward, jostling Doc painfully against the seat. He was pinned by his own arms, still zip-tied behind his back. He tried to shift his weight, ignoring the ache in his midsection, searching for any possible leverage to loosen the ties. He caught a glimpse of Hackett in the passenger seat, his braided beard swaying as they sped along the rough desert track. Carl was driving, face set in a grim scowl. Another Reaper sat next to Doc in the back, a pistol in his lap. As they rattled over uneven terrain, Doc gathered from their terse conversation that they were heading deeper into the desert to dodge any law enforcement. The drop-off point might change, or they might wait it out until dawn. At least Manny and Golden Valley are safe for the moment, Doc thought, clinging to that small hope. But I'm running out of time. The SUV careened down a dusty trail, headlights casting wild shadows across the cacti and rock formations. Hackett growled at Carl to go faster, glancing anxiously at the side mirrors. Tension coiled in the vehicle like a live wire, each occupant keyed up, ready for violence at the slightest threat. Doc, hands trussed behind him, battered and gagged, could only wait for his next opportunity. Little did the Reapers know that a silent tide of help might be forming in the darkness. The friends and allies Doc had called upon were on the move, scanning lonely highways and rest stops for any sign of the missing driver. Time was running short, and the desert night had become a battlefield of possibilities. Would help arrive before Hackett decides Doc is too dangerous to keep alive? Could the Reapers evade law enforcement and deliver their deadly cargo? And how far would Doc go to protect Golden Valley and keep his own hands free from blood? A distant coyote howl pierced the desert night as the Reaper's SUV bounced along an unmarked dirt trail. Inside the vehicle, the thick reek of sweat and tension permeated the air. Doc sat pinned in the back seat, wrists bound tightly with zip ties and a foul-tasting rag stuffed into his mouth. His jaw throbbed from the blow Crusher had landed, and every jolt over the rugged terrain sent stabs of pain through his bruised torso. In the front passenger seat, Hackett, the Reaper's MC president, kept glancing over his shoulder at Doc, lips curled in disgust. He barked curt directions to Carl, who was driving with white-knuckled intensity, swerving around rocks and low brush. Another biker, Reynolds, by the name patch on his vest, occupied the seat beside Document. He clutched a pistol on his lap, occasionally giving Doc a scornful once-over. Moonlight spilled through the dusty windshield, illuminating Hackett's braided beard and the scowl etched into his features. "Keep going until we clear the ridge," he snapped at Carl. "That's where we'll stash the crates until dawn. We can make contact with the buyer once we're sure the cops aren't tailing us." Reynolds sneered. "Hope the others are done packing up. I'm not waiting around for stragglers." Carl grunted, swerving to avoid a deep rut. "They'll catch up. I'm more worried about local law." That was too damn close. He cast a brief glance at Hackett. "You think the truck stop folks called the sheriff?" "Could be," Hackett growled. "Or maybe there was a routine patrol." "Don't matter. We'll hole up where we planned, then deliver the guns tomorrow." His eyes flickered back to Document, and as for you, he let the threat hang in the air. Doc kept silent, but his mind was racing. They must have gotten spooked when they heard the sheriff might be in the area. If Manny or anyone else got the local cops involved, it could buy me time. But even with that glimmer of hope, Doc had no illusions about his predicament. The Reapers had him bound and gagged, hidden away in the desert, with plenty of manpower to enforce their will. He forced his focus onto the restraints. Zip ties were tough, but with the right angle or friction, it was sometimes possible to wear them down or break them. If only my arms were in front of me. He tested the plastic discreetly, rotating his wrists until the tie bit deeper. Pain lanced through his skin. He eased up to avoid giving himself away. The SUV rattled around a bend in the trail, the headlights revealing a stretch of rocky ground sloping upward toward a distant ridge. The vantage point would allow the bikers to see approaching vehicles for miles. "They're setting up a fortress," Doc thought grimly. Finally, the SUV lurched to a stop near an outcropping of large boulders. Hackett and Reynolds stepped out first, guns at the ready, scanning the open desert. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot, the creak of the SUV's suspension, and Doc's own rapid heartbeat. Carl twisted in the driver's seat, glaring at Document, "Try anything, and you'll wish Crusher finished you in that building." With that, he climbed out, leaving Doc alone for a moment in the dark interior. A fleeting impulse seized him. Could I crawl over the seats, maybe drive off? But in the next instant, Hackett yanked open the rear door, tearing Doc's hope to shreds. "Out," Hackett commanded. Doc had little choice. He swung his legs out, nearly stumbling as Hackett yanked him up by the collar of his shirt. The rag still gagged him, zip ties still dug into his wrists. Two more bikers arrived on their motorcycles, their headlamps casting wild arcs over the dusty clearing. A small swirl of other Reapers' vehicles, bikes, and a second SUV gathered behind them. Amid the new arrivals, Doc recognized Crusher, shoulder-stiff from their earlier brawl, and the bald, scar-faced man. Several carried crates from the back of a pickup, probably the same stash of guns I helped unload earlier. Hackett began directing them to a shallow depression beneath a jutting rock face. It looked like a makeshift cave, hidden from casual passers-by. Doc's breathing hitched as he realized the Reapers planned to wait out the night here. The nearest sign of civilization was probably an hour's drive away, more if you took the twisting back roads. The sheriff wouldn't find them easily. Carl stomped over. "You want me to tie him to something? We can't have him trying that stunt again." Hackett nodded. "Yeah. There's a boulder behind those mesquites. Secure him there. Not too close to the stash. Don't want him near the guns." "Got it." Carl grabbed Doc by the elbow, steering him toward the shadows. They passed a few bikes, each with the Reaper's skeletal emblem on the tank, grim Reapers holding sides. Here and there, bikers stood around in loose clusters, talking in low voices, guns slung over shoulders. Someone had started a small fire, presumably for light, though it was risky in the open desert. Carl pulled Doc to a massive boulder, roughly 10 feet high, ringed by scraggly brush. He shoved Doc down, pressing the smaller of Doc's shoulders against the stone. The rough surface scraped Doc's bruised back. "There," Carl said, hauling out more zip ties. "We'll keep you out of trouble." He bound Doc's ankles together, then threaded another tie around Doc's wrists and the stone's natural protrusion. The end result, Doc was effectively pinned to the boulder, gagged, with minimal movement possible. Carl crouched, his lean face a mask of wary tension. If you behave, maybe Hackett won't have Crusher break a couple bones. We need you functional for tomorrow's drive. Doc glared through the gag, refusing to lower his eyes. You need me alive, but not necessarily unbroken, he reminded himself. The memory of that savage punch from Crusher throbbed in his jaw. He nodded stiffly, playing the captive role. For now. Carl smirked. All right then. He patted Doc's shoulder with mocking amiability, stood, and walked away, searching for an opening. Alone in the darkness, Doc tested his bindings again. The harsh plastic only tightened further. The boulder provided no comfortable angle to maneuver. He slumped, heart-hammering. I have to get free before morning. Once dawn came, the Reapers would load him into some vehicle again. He'd be under constant guard. There would be no escape then, only a forced run to deliver the guns. As he debated his next move, faint voices reached his ears from a few yards off. The Reapers were still unloading crates, no doubt double-checking their inventory. Above them, stars blazed across the sky in brilliant clusters, beautiful yet indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. Doc squeezed his eyes shut, trying to center himself. Remember your training. As a combat medic, he'd been taught how to remain calm under fire, to maintain mental clarity even when bullets flew. This was different. No bullets were flying yet, but the sense of entrapment gnawed at him. He inhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his panicked heartbeat to steady. Focus on the immediate problem, the zip ties, the gag, the boulder. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Carl stepped into view again, speaking in low tones with another biker. Doc recognized her from earlier glimpses, a tall woman with braided hair and a Reaper's patch labeled Vixen. She had a wiry build and wore an expression of perpetual disdain. Vixen's eyes flicked toward Doc, then back to Carl. They exchanged words, though Doc could only catch snippets. Morning, salvage what we can, buyers insisting on new location. Carl responded, Hackett wants to wait, keep the Doc, next move. After a moment, they moved out of earshot. Doc exhaled in frustration. So they're changing the meet-up location. That might complicate any rescue attempts, but it could also slow them down. If Manny and Cynthia were coordinating with the sheriff, maybe they'd intercept the Reapers before they could relocate. But the thought of Manny confronting these heavily armed bikers churned Doc's gut. The community at Golden Valley was tight-knit, but they weren't a paramilitary force. And Manny was pushing 60 with a bum knee to boot. Yet Manny wasn't alone. Doc had placed calls to ex-military friends scattered across the region, folks who owed him favors or simply respected his compassion. But would they know where to look? With zero phone signal, Doc couldn't update them. For all he knew, they could be searching highways or ghost towns in the wrong direction. Time oozed like molasses. The Reapers continued their preparations. Doc glimpsed men unrolling sleeping bags, others munching on jerky or passing around a flask. The tension was still high, but the immediate sense of panic had lessened for them. They believed they'd evaded the sheriff's interest. As the night deepened, the desert temperature dropped. Chill air prickled Doc's skin, a stark contrast to the earlier sweltering heat. His muscles stiffened, pinned in that awkward position against the rock. Exhaustion tugged at him. He hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours, but he fought the urge to doze off. Stay alert. Even a small window of opportunity might save him. He tested the gag next, craning his neck side to side. The rag was knotted behind his head, tied far tighter than he liked. No chance of spitting it out without shredding the cloth. He considered scraping it against the boulder, but with his arms bound behind him, he couldn't get leverage. Maybe I should wait, let them think I'm docile. Another approach, feign an injury again, but this time let them come closer, unprepared. Though it nearly got me killed last time. The Reapers were on high alert now, and repeating the same trick might end badly. Need a new angle. Manny's next move. Meanwhile, back near Golden Valley truck stop, Manny paced the lounge with short, urgent strides. His phone lay on a table, speaker engaged, as he spoke to a distant voice. Jeb, an old friend from Redwood City and a longtime trucker with connections of his own. I'm telling you, Jeb, these Reapers are well armed, Manny said, voice tight with worry. We need more than a handful of folks with shotguns. If we try to storm them, it'll be a bloodbath. Jeb's voice crackled back. I hear you, Manny. But we're on the way. Got 4 rigs caravanning. Each driver's packing, and we got some ex-army guys along for the ride. It's the best we can do on short notice. Cynthia hovered beside Manny, arms folded protectively. How soon can you be here? Couple hours, maybe less, Jeb answered. We just crossed the county line. You said the Reapers took Doc, right? Yeah, Manny confirmed. He left the diner to meet them, and next thing we know, they're gone. We've had no contact since. He paused, raking a hand through his thinning hair. We think the Reapers might have run into the sheriff or heard rumors of a patrol. They probably fled into the desert. Could be anywhere by now. A beat of silence. Then Jeb said, we'll get to Golden Valley first, regroup, see if we can pick up a trail. Hang tight, Manny. Roger that, Manny murmured, ending the call. He turned to Cynthia. That's a slight relief, but even with Jeb's crew, we're not exactly a special ops team. We need a plan. Rosie, emerging from the diner kitchen, wiped her hands on a dish rag. The worried lines etched into her face seemed deeper than ever. If the sheriff suspects they're in the desert, maybe he's sending deputies to search? Manny nodded. Walden's a good man, but the department's small. They can't comb the entire desert swiftly. If we rely on them alone, we might be waiting days. Doc doesn't have days. A heavy silence fell among them. Cynthia's expression hardened with resolve. Then we do what truckers do best, spread out. We can drive in small teams, scanning remote roads, and use radios to coordinate. If any of us spot the Reapers, we call for backup. Jeb's folks can help once they arrive. Manny grimaced. You realize how risky that is? The Reapers might ambush a smaller group. We won't engage unless we're sure we have numbers on our side, Cynthia replied. But it's the only way to find Doc in time. We can't just sit. Rosie nodded. I'll stay here and keep the truck stop running as a base. Keep the phone lines open, coordinate with the sheriff if we get a lead. Manny, shoulders sagging, finally relented. All right, but we move carefully and we stay in contact. We can't lose more people to these maniacs. A desert gathering. Out in the desert, the hours crept toward midnight. Doc's body ached from sustained tension. Though the Reapers had mostly settled, a few still prowled the perimeter. He spotted silhouette after silhouette backlit by the flickering campfire. Their voices carried on the wind, jokes, complaints, snatches of profanity-laden banter. Here and there, talk of the buyer drifted past Doc's hearing. A big sale, evidently, but complicated now that the sheriff was poking around. Despite everything, Doc felt a grim flash of hope. The more complicated the deal became, the more time the Reapers would need. Time for Manny, time for whoever else might be looking for me. A pair of headlights appeared on a distant crest. Doc watched as another motorcycle wove down the slope, its engine a snarling buzz. The biker halted near the main cluster, dismounted, and strode up to Hackett. From Doc's vantage, partially obscured by the boulder, he couldn't see the newcomer's face clearly, but he noted frantic gestures. More upset news? Hackett's posture stiffened. He barked an order, pointing toward the boulder. The new arrival hustled over, accompanied by Crusher, who gripped the butt of his gun. They approached Doc's makeshift prison with purposeful strides. Crusher flashed a flashlight beam into Doc's eyes. This him, the newcomer asked. The voice was high-pitched, almost sneering. That's the Doc, Crusher confirmed. The new arrival crouched to examine Doc's face. We lost 2 men, he said abruptly, glaring. At that old diner. Word is, the sheriff's guys got bold. Or maybe it was some local yahoos with guns. Either way, they pinned them down until they ran out of ammo. The Reapers are regrouping at the fallback site. He spat. Boss wants us to load up and head out soon as possible. Doc's stomach twisted. Shots fired at the diner? Innocent people could be hurt. But he also wondered if that was Manny and Cynthia's doing. If so, at least Manny was still alive. The Reapers might have gotten a taste of real resistance. Crusher shrugged. We're not going anywhere until sunrise. Hackett doesn't want to risk the dark on unfamiliar roads. The newcomer huffed. Well, if the cops are tough enough to take out 2 of ours, we need to be on the move. Hackett has to, eh? From behind them, Hackett's voice boomed, I don't have to do anything. I'm the president. You tell the others we leave at dawn, or they can try finding a new crew. He emerged from the shadows, gaze raking over Doc with contempt. We're not bungling the sale just because a couple hotshot deputies showed up. Now, get out of my face. Shoved aside by Hackett, the newcomer stalked off, muttering curses. Crusher gave a short laugh and swung his flashlight down at Doc's ankles, checking the bindings. Hackett turned his full attention on Document. You caused me a lot of trouble, you know that? His voice was surprisingly calm, but his eyes were cold. If not for your skills, I'd shoot you right now. But you're too useful. Tomorrow, you'll drive for us and patch up anyone who might need it. If you cooperate, maybe we let you limp away afterward. Doc didn't move, only glaring from beneath the gag. That apparently satisfied Hackett, who snorted and motioned for Crusher to follow. The pair left Doc alone once more, their footsteps fading into the general din. A twisted moral dilemma. Hours trickled by, and the temperature plunged further. Doc's breath misted in front of him, and every shift in position sent a flare of pain through his arms. The battered face of his watch, still strapped to his left wrist, was hidden beneath the zip ties. He had no sense of the exact time, only that it must be past midnight. Somewhere behind the boulder, a hushed conversation started. Doc strained to listen, two voices, low and urgent. Still bleeding, you idiot, might get infected. Shut up, man. I'm fine. A few seconds later, the second speaker groaned softly, muttering curses. Doc caught the phrase damned bullet graze and perked up. A Reaper must have been wounded earlier, perhaps by the sheriff or Manny's crew. Doc weighed his options. If one of them is injured, they might need medical help. If I offer it, maybe they'll loosen my restraints. But that could also backfire. And do I really want to help a violent criminal who's terrorized my friends? His medic's training warred with his conscience. He remembered all the times he'd patched up fellow soldiers, local villagers, even foreign nationals who were technically the enemy. The oath he'd silently taken to preserve life whenever possible. These men are criminals, an inner voice hissed. But they're still human. And maybe this is a chance to gain leverage. Doc inhaled through his nose. He made a series of muffled grunts, attempting to draw attention. MMPH. MMPH. He rocked sideways against the boulder, hoping the noise would carry. The voices stopped. He heard footsteps approach. A flashlight beam swept over his face again, blinding him. Why's he making noise? A man demanded. Doc recognized it as Carl's voice. You want another smack, Doc? Doc grunted once more, then jerked his head toward the side of the boulder where the two men had been talking. He tried to convey someone's hurt, let me help with just his eyes and muffled sounds. It was a long shot. Carl frowned. What are you on about? A second beam appeared, revealing the scar-faced man. He regarded Doc suspiciously. He's pointing with his head, like he wants to say something about Rhino's wound. Doc nodded vigorously, eyes pleading. Carl and Scarface exchanged an incredulous look. He's a medic, Carl muttered. Maybe he's offering to help. Rhino did get nicked. Scarface spat. You seriously want to let him near Rhino? He'll snap Rhino's neck the second we cut that gag. Carl hesitated, shining the light back into Doc's eyes. You won't try anything stupid this time, right? Because we'll kill you on the spot. Doc blinked rapidly, doing his best to appear earnest. He gave a slight shake of his head. No, I won't try anything. The next part was more complicated. But maybe there's a chance I can exploit a moment of freedom. He braced for the gamble. Carl sucked his teeth, then stepped away, returning moments later with Hackett and a limping man who must be Rhino, a hulking Reaper with a bandana around his shaved head. The bandana was darkly stained near his right shoulder, presumably from a bullet graze. He winced as he moved. Hackett glowered at Document. So, you want to patch Rhino up? Doc nodded, letting out a muffled grunt of agreement. Hackett eyed Rhino's wound. We tried some basic first aid, but it won't stop bleeding. Might need stitches. He considered Document all right, but if you make one false move, I'll have Crusher blow your kneecaps off. He turned to Carl. Cut the gag and free his hands, but keep him tethered at the ankles. Carl hesitated, but Hackett's glare made him comply. He produced a knife and sliced the gag's knot with one quick motion. The dirty rag fell to the ground, and Doc coughed at the sudden intake of cool air. Then Carl yanked Doc's wrists from behind the boulder's protrusion, slicing the zip tie that bound Doc to the rock. The tie snapped with a harsh crack. Before Doc could move, Scarface pinned a gun barrel against his spine. Try it, the man growled. I dare you. Doc raised his hand slowly, wrists still ringed by ragged plastic. Carl used the knife again, freeing him. Doc flexed his fingers, wincing at the deep marks carved into his flesh. He looked at Hackett. I need my med kit. Your med kit is back in your rig. Hackett shook his head. Not an option. Doc pressed his lips together, scanning the area. Then I need something to disinfect the wound and something to bandage it, clean cloth, water, maybe alcohol. And a needle and thread if you want it sewn up properly. Rhino grunted. That's too much trouble, boss. Hackett exhaled impatiently. Check the supplies in the SUV. We've got some water bottles, a bottle of whiskey, maybe a sewing kit in the side pocket. Carl motioned for Rhino to sit on a nearby flat rock. Scarface kept his pistol leveled at Doc's chest, making it clear no misstep would be tolerated. The temperature had fallen even more, a biting chill, but Rhino was sweating from pain. Doc knelt beside the wounded man. The bullet graze ran across Rhino's shoulder. Blood matted the bandana tied around it. Doc gingerly peeled back the makeshift dressing, ignoring Rhino's pained hiss. You're lucky the bullet didn't lodge. It's a deep scrape, but it needs cleaning. Doc took a moment to orient himself, then beckoned to Carl, who returned with the whiskey and a small plastic first aid kit, likely pilfered from some other vehicle. Pour whiskey on this cloth, hold it over the wound. Doc paused, swallowing hard. The role of medic overshadowed his hatred for these men. Saving a life is saving a life. We'll flush it out with water after. Carl knelt, glaring suspiciously. Don't get any ideas. Doc pressed the soaked cloth to Rhino's wound. Rhino let out a guttural moan and Doc felt his body tense. Easy, Doc said softly. Bite down on something if you need to. Despite everything, compassion slipped into his voice, residual instincts from countless field dressings. With the wound cleaned, Doc turned to the kit Carl had brought, a spool of cheap thread and a single needle, plus a handful of bandages. He had no gloves, no proper antiseptic beyond whiskey. But it would have to do. He threaded the needle carefully, used a bit more whiskey to sterilize it as best he could, then held Rhino's shoulder. This is going to hurt. Rhino nodded, jaw clenched. Scarface hovered above, pistol ready, as if expecting Doc to turn the needle into a weapon. Doc ignored him, focusing on the suture. The smell of blood and alcohol, the lamplight from a reaper's flashlight, the hush of the desert, Doc's mind flickered to old war memories, sewing up wounded comrades under the relentless sun of a foreign land. He worked with smooth efficiency, closing the wound. Rhino stifled groans, sweat dripping onto the dusty ground. Finally, Doc applied the bandages in careful layers. That's the best I can do here, he said, stepping back. Keep it clean. If you have antibiotics, take them. Hackett and several onlookers watched. Some looked impressed, others eyed Doc with continued distrust. Carl gave a small nod. He knows his stuff. Hackett's stare was unreadable. Good. He turned to Rhino. Better. Rhino flexed experimentally, grimacing. Better than it was. Thanks, document. The gratitude in his tone was grudging but genuine. Doc, arms free, stood amidst the circle of armed bikers. Scarface still had a gun pointed at him. Now what? Doc asked quietly. Hackett jerked his chin at Carl. Tie him back up. Carl stepped forward, coil of zip ties in hand. Doc felt frustration well up in his chest. He'd hoped they might spare him another round of restraints after he'd helped Rhino. But the Reapers were no fools. They bound his wrists once more, though not as tightly as before. The boulder beckoned again. Wait, Carl said suddenly, stopping Scarface. He looked to Hackett. If we tie him to the boulder again, he can't help if anything else goes wrong tonight. We might need him. Let's just keep him under guard but let him move a little. Hackett stroked his braided beard. Fine. But if he even twitches, shoot him. He fixed Doc with a cold glare. You try running, we'll find that truck stop and kill everyone. Doc's mouth went dry. He believed Hackett's threat. Understood, he said hoarsely. Carl gestured at a stunted tree near the circle of bikes. Sit there. Don't speak unless spoken to. Another Reaper took up position behind Doc, gun in hand. The message was clear, one step out of line, you die. Still, the fact that they hadn't pinned him to the boulder again was a small improvement. Maybe this new arrangement offered better angles to observe the camp or a path to slip away if an opportunity arose. He sank onto the ground, resting his aching back against the tree's trunk. His wrists hurt, but at least the zip ties weren't cutting off circulation. Rhino, still grimacing, lumbered away to join a cluster of bikers warming themselves around a portable stove. Scarface disappeared into the darkness on patrol. Hackett resumed organizing crates. Carl lingered nearby, arms folded, watching Doc with guarded eyes. Around them, the night was impossibly vast and cold. A friend in strange places? As Carl stared at Doc, his expression shifted, almost contemplative. The night wind ruffled his patchy beard. Once the other bikers turned their attention elsewhere, Carl strode closer, kneeling so that only Doc could hear his whisper. "Why'd you help Rhino?" Doc blinked, taken aback. "I'm a medic," he whispered. "Doesn't matter who's hurt. I can't stand by and watch someone bleed out." Carl frowned as if mulling that over. "You know these guys wouldn't do the same for you, right?" Doc gave a bitter half-smile. "I'm aware." For a moment, Carl looked like he wanted to say more, but then Crusher ambled over, a scowl on his face. Carl straightened, folding his arms again. The moment of near conversation was gone. Crusher snapped at Carl. "Hackett wants us to move the crates deeper under the ledge." "Get over there." Carl cast Doc a final glance, then stomped off. "Crusher, I document, don't get any ideas just because you're not chained to a rock. Remember, one move, you're dead." Doc nodded silently. Inside, something about Carl's curiosity nagged at him. He's not as gung-ho as the others. Maybe he's searching for a way out of this life, or just has his own agenda. Doc stored the thought away, not daring to hope too much. Preparations at Golden Valley. Night dragged on toward the early morning hours at Golden Valley. Manny and Cynthia were out on the road with a small convoy of friendlies, scanning highways and backroads, peering through the gloom for any sign of Reaper activity. At the truck stop itself, Rosie manned the phones, intercepting calls from Jeb's incoming group and from the local sheriff's office, which was spread thin. Parked outside the diner, a battered pickup rumbled, heater running. Inside, a local driver named Georgie fiddled with his CB radio. "We got nothing on the channels, Rosie," he said. "No sign of Doc or those bikers. Manny's still searching the north route." Rosie sighed. "All right, keep me posted. If they spot something, lights, tire tracks, anything, they'll call it in." She turned away from the cold night air, heading back into the diner's warmth. Her gaze strayed to the table where Doc used to sit, sipping coffee. "Come back safe, document." She refused to consider any other possibility. The desert camp's slow burn. At the Reaper camp, the night stretched on. Some bikers dozed in sleeping bags, others took shifts patrolling. Hackett seemed tireless, prowling around the outskirts, barking orders at anyone who relaxed too much. The portable stove hissed quietly, offering a meager source of warmth to the men huddled around it. Doc's body felt numb, arms still bound. He fought off waves of fatigue, listening for any commotion that might signal rescue or conflict. Each time a biker revved a motorcycle engine, he tensed, hoping it might be Manny or a deputy or one of his old army buddies. But it was always just the Reapers rearranging positions. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Doc guessed by the moon's position, an uproar of excited voices rose from the far side of the camp. Flashlight beams darted about. Doc glimpsed a Reaper staggering, clutching his head, while another swore viciously. Hackett sprinted over, followed by Crusher and Carl. Keeping silent, Doc observed from a distance. The Reapers began scanning the area near a line of battered shrubs. Someone shouted shots. Another answered, No, it's a snake." Then laughter erupted, half relieved, half anxious. A rattlesnake had apparently startled one of the bikers. The tension in the group was tangible. They were jumpy, seeing threats in every shadow. And that was precisely Doc's advantage. Paranoia could breed mistakes. If he could nudge them into another moment of chaos, maybe he could slip away or disarm one of them. But with a half-dozen guns pointed his direction at any given time, the risk was immense. A desperate attempt. An idea began to form, one that was equal parts risky and desperate. Doc remembered the corner of the med kit from earlier. There might be a small scalpel or a pair of scissors in there if it was a standard kit. That could sever zip ties if he could get his hands on it unnoticed. But where was that kit now? Likely near Rhino or in the SUV. Possibly within reach if Doc caused a distraction. But what distraction? He decided on something rudimentary, fire. The Reapers had multiple small campfires and stoves. If he could spark a bigger blaze, or at least create the illusion of one, it might force them to scramble, giving him a window to move. He tested his ankles, which had been bound earlier. Had they left them free this time? Thankfully, yes. Only his wrists were zip-tied. He could walk, albeit carefully, as long as the guard allowed it. He surveyed the immediate area, scattered brush, some old tumbleweeds, a few fuel containers near the crates. Dangerous, but I might not have another shot. If the container was spilled, flames could spread quickly in this dry environment. It would be reckless. But so is letting them haul me to their next location where I'll have no hope of rescue. It would require a spark, though. He had no lighter, no matches. But these guys are all smokers. He recalled Crusher's cigarette from earlier. Possibly others carried lighters. If Doc could somehow snag one. He slumped back against the tree, stowing the plan for a moment. He needed an opening, or else a random attempt at arson would end with a bullet in his back. Wait for them to be half asleep. Wait for an argument. Something. Carl's confession. Shortly after, Carl returned to stand guard. He held a half-burned cigarette in one hand, a small flashlight in the other. The tip of the cigarette glowed dully, leaving a faint trail of smoke in the cold air. Doc's eyes flicked to it, fire, and then to Carl's expression. The biker crouched a few feet away, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "What's going on in that mind of yours, Doc?" he said quietly, voice tinged with something like curiosity again. Doc shrugged, careful not to draw attention from others. "Just wondering if I'll see tomorrow." Carl's lips twitched in a humorless smile. "Fair. But you saved Rhino's hide. That counts for something, maybe?" He flicked ash off the end of his cigarette. "You were Army, right?" Doc narrowed his eyes. "Yeah. Combat medic." Carl nodded. "I did a year in the Marines, dishonorably discharged." He paused, scanning the distance. "That was a lifetime ago, but I know skill when I see it." Doc inhaled slowly. "So why run with these guys?" Carl let out a low laugh. "Why'd you join the Army? Because it seemed like the best way out of a dead-end life? Same with me. But I messed up, got discharged, and ended up with the Reapers. They pay better than flipping burgers. Let's leave it at that." Doc considered the man's words. "You want out?" Carl's jaw clenched. "Does it matter? Once you're in, you're in. If I try to leave, they'll treat me like they treat you, worse, maybe?" "Maybe not," Doc murmured. "You could still do the right thing." Carl stood up abruptly, eyes flashing. "Don't preach at me. I'm not one of your war buddies. I do what I must to survive." He flicked the cigarette butt aside. "Just keep your mouth shut, document." Then he strode off into the darkness, leaving Doc alone with the guard on the perimeter. But Carl's frustration had given Doc a clue. There was doubt in him. A crack in the Reaper's iron unity. If I can get Carl to help me, we might both escape. That might be a pipe dream, but it was a more promising angle than sabotage alone. Doc's teeth chattered in the pre-dawn chill. Though the desert could scorch you by day, the nights and early mornings could be bitterly cold. Around him, most of the Reapers still lurked in small clusters near the rocky ledge and the handful of vehicles they'd driven in. A few dozed upright against boulders, heads bowed, arms folded, their guns resting within easy reach. He himself was bound at the wrists with zip ties, sitting hunched against a stunted mesquite tree. Despite the discomfort in his bruised ribs and throbbing jaw, he was wide awake. His thoughts circled in endless loops. Escape. Rescue. Attack? Persuade Carl? At intervals, he snuck glances at Carl, who prowled the perimeter with a flashlight in hand, occasionally puffing on a cigarette. The sky was changing. A faint glow lit the horizon to the east, hinting that sunrise was near. Hackett, the Reaper's president, had repeatedly said they would move out at dawn. When that happened, Doc's slim chance of a getaway might vanish altogether. Unless Manny or the law intercept them on the road, Doc thought. But it's a big desert. Doc closed his eyes, inhaling the biting air through his nose. Pain radiated from the zip ties cutting into his skin. I have to do something soon. Memories from his Army days rose unbidden, pinned down behind a half-crumbled wall overseas, waiting for backup that might never come. He knew the helplessness of such moments, and he also knew that one well-timed action could change everything. Manny, Cynthia, and allies on the move. Some 20 miles away, Manny drove along a cracked, barely marked highway in his old Freightliner, scanning the landscape. Cynthia rode shotgun. Their faces were drawn from worry and lack of sleep. 2 more rigs and a pickup followed close behind, making a modest convoy of supporters. Jeb's crew from Redwood City, along with other concerned truckers. Most were armed, though none claimed to be itching for a fight. Manny slowed as they neared a shallow ravine off to the right. "Look at that," he muttered, pointing. A battered sign reading Desert Dino Park. 1 mile leaned precariously, peppered with bullet holes. Cynthia pulled out a paper map, cross-referencing it against memory. That place closed decades ago. It's basically a ghost site. The road leads back into the desert, might connect to some old service trails. Manny cast a worried glance her way. You think it's worth checking? The Reapers might have chosen a remote spot like that, plenty of cover, far from law enforcement or random passers-by. But the desert was filled with such spots. Cynthia chewed her lower lip. I can't say for sure, but we need to check every possibility. We already searched the main roads for hours. The Reapers are probably off the beaten path. Manny exhaled. All right, let's see if we can get the rigs through. He motioned out the window at the small convoy. Jeb, at the wheel of a second Freightliner, drew up alongside. Manny made a series of hand signals indicating they'd be turning off the main highway to investigate. Jeb nodded, tapping his CB mic in acknowledgement. They veered onto a narrower, rutted track that cut through patches of desert scrub. The morning sky was still dark, but the hint of sunrise gave just enough light to see the faint tire prints in the dust, signs that vehicles had passed here recently. Manny's pulse quickened. This might be it. Cynthia pointed out fresh tracks, visible in the faint glow of their headlights. Look, Manny. There. Definitely multiple vehicles. Some look like motorcycles. Could be them. Manny felt a surge of hope and fear. We'd better be careful. If we come upon them unaware, we'll have the element of surprise. But if they spot us first... Cynthia tightened her grip on the dashboard. We'll keep low and quiet. If we find them, we call in the sheriff. We can't just charge in blindly. Agreed. Manny eased off the throttle, heart pounding. They might be closing in on Doc at last. Dawn at the Reaper camp. A pale yellow light began to creep over the desert floor. The Reapers stirred. Some stamped their feet to warm up, while others tossed dirt over the small fires. Voices rose, urgent, coarse, a mix of fatigue and anticipation. They'd stashed their gun crates beneath the rock ledge for the night, and now they were hauling them out again. Nearby, Carl approached Doc, blade in hand. Doc tensed. Is he about to cut me free or something worse? Carl quickly sliced through the zip ties restraining Doc's wrists. The plastic fell away, leaving raw indents behind. Doc winced, rubbing feeling back into his hands. He was free for the moment anyway. But a second later, Carl pressed the tip of the blade lightly against Doc's ribs. Stand up, he ordered, voice neutral, and don't try to run. Doc obeyed, though his muscles protested from hours of immobility. What now? Carl nodded toward Hackett, who was directing several bikers near the box truck, the same battered vehicle they'd forced Doc to drive. We're heading out. You get behind that wheel again. Doc's stomach nodded. If he got in that box truck, traveling deeper into the desert or across state lines, his chance of escape would dwindle to almost nothing. But if he resisted, the Reapers might kill him, or worse, punish Golden Valley. Time is running out. Hackett barked across the camp. Doc, haul your backside over here. We leave in 5. Doc swallowed, exchanging a meaningful look with Carl. Carl's gaze flicked away. He's still conflicted, Doc thought. But not enough to help me outright. Not yet. A large man with a bushy beard, Crusher, stepped forward, pistol resting in the crook of his arm. You heard the boss, he growled. Move. They herded Doc to the box truck, which sat near the center of camp. Several Reapers were loading crates of weapons into its cargo area, stacking them with tense efficiency. Nearby, Rhino, still bandaged from Doc's patchwork surgery, supervised, wincing with each shift of his injured shoulder. Hackett stood by the driver's door, arms crossed over his vest, scanning the surroundings. The first rays of the sun peeked over the ridge, painting the camp in pale gold and deep shadows. Dust swirled around them, kicked up by the scuffling of boots. All right, Hackett said, pointing at Document, get in. You follow our lead bike. Stay in convoy formation. No funny business, or I'll put a bullet in your skull while we're moving. Doc's pulse hammered, but he climbed into the cab. The seat was as uncomfortable as he remembered, torn vinyl, springs poking him. Carl shoved a key into Doc's hand and followed him into the passenger side. Scarface hopped up behind them, perched on a small bench seat. He propped a shotgun across his lap, pointing it generally in Doc's direction. Outside, Hackett nodded in satisfaction. Crusher, right up front with Carl. Rhino, you take the second SUV. Let's move. A series of engines roared to life, motorcycles, an SUV, and the battered box truck. Doc turned the key, letting the old engine sputter and catch. He gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding. Once they left camp, there would be no second chances. The convoy departs. Dust erupted under the tires as the Reaper's convoy pulled out. The lead biker, Crusher, took point on his motorcycle, forging a path across the uneven desert trail. Carl, in the passenger seat, craned to see around the truck's hood while Scarface kept the shotgun ready. They descended from the ridge, weaving between clumps of sagebrush and mesquite. After a half-mile of rugged terrain, they hit a slightly better dirt road. The truck rattled violently on every bump, threatening to shake loose the stacked crates and back. Doc's sweaty palms gripped the wheel, mind darting between fear and strategy. Is Manny out there searching? If so, would he catch sight of this dust trail? If Manny's close, he'd see a large caravan of bikes and trucks. Hard to miss. Unless the Reapers have mapped a route that avoids main roads entirely. The uncertainly nodded at him. Doc cast a sidelong glance at Carl. The man looked tense, Jaw said. Could I leverage the tension? But Scarface's scowl and the shotgun in his hand spelled danger if Doc tried anything. Dust layered itself on the windshield as they churned down the trail. Carl occasionally gave low commands, bear left here, watch the rock on the right. Doc followed them, mind whirling. If I have to crash this thing or stall it, I might need to pick my moment carefully, somewhere I can jump out and not get shot immediately. Every couple of minutes, the road leveled out a bit. They were gradually approaching the old highway if Doc had his bearings right. The sun climbed higher, revealing a vast panorama of dusty terrain and far-off mesas. He kept scanning the horizon for any sign of Manny's rigs or law enforcement vehicles. Nothing, just emptiness. A coyote loping across a dry wash, a scattering of cacti. He forced down a wave of despair. I can't rely on luck alone. Manny spots a trail. Not too far away, Manny's convoy inched across a rough desert track, the truck's suspensions groaning in protest. Cynthia stood in the open passenger door, clinging to the handle and scanning the distance with binoculars. A swirl of dust far off to the west caught her eye. She focused the binoculars and her pulse jumped. Manny! Over there, looks like multiple vehicles kicking up dust. Might be a convoy. Manny braked, gazing where she pointed. It was faint, but the pattern of dust suggested a few vehicles traveling together. We found them, he murmured, adrenaline surging. He clicked on his CB, patching in Jeb and the other trucks behind them. We see dust trails to the west, maybe a mile out. Likely the Reapers. Let's close in carefully, lights off if possible. Stay behind any rise or ridge we can. We don't want them spotting us early. Copy that, Jeb's voice crackled back. We'll follow your lead. Cynthia hopped back inside, slamming the door. If that's them, what's the plan? Manny's fingers drummed the steering wheel anxiously. We can't just open fire. We're not vigilantes and Doc's in that convoy somewhere. We need to block or disable their vehicles, then force them to stand down until the sheriff arrives. Cynthia grimaced. Easier said than done. They've got guns, Manny. And we might be outnumbered. We only have, 8 or 9 folks total who can fight. Manny gave a solemn nod. We do the smart. Let's try to circle around, get ahead of them on the main road and set up some kind of blockade. If they're forced to stop or slow down, maybe we can hold them in place. He steered the Freightliner toward a rocky outcrop that rose between them and the dust trails, hoping to use natural cover. If they moved quickly but discreetly, they might outflank the Reapers before the outlaws realized they were being hunted. Carl's doubts reached boiling point. Meanwhile, the Reapers' convoy reached a slightly broader dirt road that pointed toward the old highway. Crusher's motorcycle led the way with the box truck not far behind. The second SUV trailed, carrying Rhino and 2 more Reapers. A few bikes flanked them, engines growling in the morning light. Inside the truck cab, the tension was palpable. Scarface occasionally cracked the passenger window to spit, never lowering his shotgun. Carl frowned at a worn paper map sprawled on his lap. We'll hit the highway in about 2 miles, Carl said, tracing a route with his fingertip. Then swing south around the next county. Should avoid any major towns. Our new rendezvous is just over the border. Doc forced calm into his voice. That's a long drive with a truck this old and with the sheriff reportedly sniffing around. Carl shot him a narrow-eyed look. You worry about driving. Doc kept quiet. You worry about your conscience. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The reflection showed Scarface's cold stare. No opening there. They rolled on for another few minutes. Sunbeams angled low, illuminating the sparse desert plants along the roadside. Then Carl stiffened, leaning forward to peer out the windshield. Crusher's slowing down. Something's up. Indeed, Crusher's bike had braked, kicking up gravel. The lead rider looked like he was scanning the distance. The entire convoy gradually lurched to a halt. Dust drifted around them. Scarface leaned forward, hissing, could be cops. Or maybe someone else. His knuckles whitened around the shotgun. Carl grimaced. Yeah. Or maybe just a busted patch of road. He pulled out a small pair of binoculars, squinting through the windshield. Hard to tell from here. Doc's pulse hammered. This might be the moment Manny tries something. Or it might be a false alarm. Either way, the Reapers were jumpy. If the blockade Manny had planned was up ahead, a confrontation was about to erupt. Seconds ticked by. Then Crusher waved his arm, signaling for the convoy to proceed slowly. Carl eased back in his seat, exhaling in relief. Scarface muttered a curse at the false alarm. The truck lumbered forward. Dust clouds rose behind them. Each yard felt like an eternity to document. If Manny's out there, I hope he's ready. Because we're almost back on the highway. He flicked his gaze to Carl's side, where the man's jacket sagged. A corner of a lighter protruded from a pocket. A potential ignition source. The memory of his plan to spark a fire skittered through his thoughts, though with the entire convoy in motion, it was riskier than ever. The blockade. Up ahead, around a slight bend, the dusty dirt road joined an older, crumbling two-lane highway. On one side, a natural ridge provided some elevation, on the other, the desert stretched outward. At first glance, the highway looked deserted. But as Crusher's bike roared onto the pavement, he suddenly swerved, brakes squealing. The reason became clear a heartbeat later. Two big rigs were parked sideways across both lanes, forming a makeshift barricade. Additional pickups and sedans were arranged behind them, and a handful of figures, some with rifles, stood at the ready. Doc's heart soared. He recognized Manny's Freightliner and Cynthia's silhouette behind the driver's door. Also Jeb, a stocky older trucker, perched near the front bumper of another rig, rifle in hand. A cluster of Manny's allies fanned out behind the vehicles. The Reaper's convoy skidded to a stop. Crusher kicked his bike into a sideways position, calling back to the others. The second SUV halted abruptly, tires screeching. Anxious shouts erupted among the bikers. Guns were drawn. In the box truck, Scarface whipped the shotgun muzzle toward the windshield. What the hell? Carl's face contorted with alarm. Doc let out an involuntary gasp. They came. They really came. He felt hope surge, but also dread. This could explode into bloodshed fast. Manny's group was outnumbered unless the sheriff was lurking somewhere nearby. The standstill lasted seconds. Then Manny stepped around the lead rig, hands raised. He shouted, voice echoing in the still air. Doc, you in there? Scarface spat. Shut up, old man. He racked the shotgun. Doc braced himself, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm here, he called out the open side window. They're armed, don't do anything rash. Behind the barricade, Jeb hollered, release our friend and turn around, or we won't let you pass. Carl shot a glance at Doc, his expression torn. Scarface snarled, they've got a death wish. We'll mow 'em down. From behind, Rhino's SUV revved, inching forward. Hackett's voice rang out over the convoy, you're making a big mistake, truckers? Move aside or you'll regret it. Manny responded loudly, we've got the law inbound. You're not going anywhere with those guns. Give up now. For a moment, the desert hush seemed to amplify everyone's breathing. Then Crusher, face twisted in rage, raised his pistol and fired a shot into the air. Last warning. Clear the road or die. All at once, Manny's allies took cover behind the rigs. Cynthia ducked and Jeb crouched behind a wheel well. A few of them aimed weapons at the Reaper's formation, though no one fired yet. Doc's pulse thundered in his ears. The standoff teetered on the edge of an all-out firefight. If the Reapers opened up, Manny's group might be gunned down, or vice versa. I have to do something. Tipping point. Hackett emerged from the SUV behind the truck, flanked by two heavily armed Reapers. He stepped forward until he was almost shoulder to shoulder with Crusher. I don't see any cops, Hackett shouted, scanning the horizon. Just a handful of truckers playing vigilante. Manny, still half hidden behind his Freightliner, returned. "We've called the sheriff. He'll be here any minute." Hackett barked a harsh laugh. "Then you can all die together." He raised an automatic pistol, leveling it at Manny's rig. "Move or we move you." Fear spiked in Doc's chest. Manny was no soldier, nor were most of these truckers. They can't handle a pitched gunfight with the Reapers. He pictured Rosie back at Golden Valley, anxiously awaiting news. All it would take was one shot to spark mutual carnage. He had to defuse it or else create an advantage for Manny's group. Time to force their hand. Doc slammed the truck's gearshift into reverse and floored the gas. The box truck lurched backward, rocking Carl and Scarface in their seats. Gravel sprayed behind them as the wheels spun. Scarface yelled, "What the?" He lunged for the wheel, but Doc yanked it sideways, causing the truck to swerve violently. The cargo in back clattered as crates tumbled. Carl, wide-eyed, shouted, "Doc, are you nuts?" Doc's maneuver kicked up a dense cloud of dust and debris behind the truck, obscuring the Reaper's line of sight. Several bikers coughed and stumbled back. Even the SUV had to reverse to avoid collision. In that moment of chaos, Manny's group seized the initiative. Engines roared behind the blockade as one of Jeb's rigs surged forward, partially blocking the Reaper's retreat. Shots rang out. Who fired first was unclear, but the crisp crack of gunfire echoed across the desert. Bullets pinged off the pavement and whined overhead. Some Reapers dived behind their bikes for cover. Manny's allies returned fire sporadically from behind the rig fenders. Dust thickened, swirling in the early sunlight. Inside the box truck, Scarface recovered enough to thrust the shotgun at Doc's torso. "Stop, you idiot," he bellowed, finger tightening on the trigger. Carl, cursing, grabbed Scarface's arm, redirecting the barrel. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling of the cab, blowing a ragged hole. Smoke and bits of upholstery rained down. Doc winced, ears ringing. That split second was all he needed to shift from reverse to drive, stomping on the gas again. The truck lurched forward, smashing into a line of Reaper bikes that had swerved to avoid the dust cloud. Metal crunched as at least 2 motorcycles were knocked aside like toys. Hackett's enraged shout resounded, "Stop him! Shoot the truck's tires!" Bullets thumped into the truck's side panels, but the box truck lurched onward another dozen yards before the front tires blew out. The steering jerked violently out of Doc's hands, and the truck careened to the right, slamming into a ditch. Carl and Scarface were thrown forward. The airbag, long since non-functional, did nothing. Doc's forehead cracked against the steering wheel, sending stars bursting across his vision. Pain flared, but he clung to consciousness. Coughing through the dust, he fumbled with the door handle. Scarface groaned, pinned awkwardly between seats. Carl was sprawled across the passenger dash, blinking in a daze. Doc managed to shove the door open and tumble onto the dusty ground outside. Bedlam. Gunshots continued to erupt in bursts on the highway. Manny's blockade had advanced slightly, pinned down by returning fire from Hackett and Crusher. Some Reapers lay prone behind their bikes, muzzle flashes spitting from pistols and rifles. A swirl of voices, shouts, and curses filled the air. Doc staggered away from the truck, blinking blood out of his eyes from a cut on his brow. He could barely process the chaotic scene. "We've triggered a war zone." Panic roiled in his gut. He dropped to one knee behind a chunk of twisted metal, one of the smashed bikes, and scanned for Manny's familiar face. A volley of bullets peppered the pavement near him, forcing him flat. He glimpsed Manny's Freightliner across the way, engine idling, some bullet holes scarring the side. Manny was crouched by a front tire, rifle clutched in trembling hands. Cynthia was next to him, returning fire with measured caution. Suddenly, a Reaper darted out from behind the overturned SUV, raising a pistol. He aimed at Manny. Doc's heart seized. He couldn't let Manny get shot. Without thinking, Doc grabbed a jagged metal shard from the debris and hurled it at the gunman. The improvised projectile struck the Reaper's arm, making him jerk sideways. The shot went wide. Manny reacted instantly, firing a single round that caught the Reaper in the leg. The man collapsed, howling. Manny flashed a stunned glance in Doc's direction, recognizing him from across the dust-filled mayhem. Doc gave a quick nod, relief flooding him. He's alive for now. Carl's decision. Behind the wrecked truck, Carl stumbled out coughing. Blood trickled from his hairline. He shook his head to clear it and spotted Doc crouched behind the ruined bike. For a split second, their eyes locked. Doc half expected Carl to raise a gun. Instead, Carl stood still, a conflict raging in his expression. He's torn between loyalty to the Reapers and something else, Doc thought. The swirling dust and gunfire framed Carl like a man at a crossroads. A shout snapped Carl out of his trance. Hackett was advancing, pistol drawn, bellowing Carl's name. The Reaper president's face was contorted with fury. "Get over here and help us put these fools down." Carl looked from Hackett to Document. Then, with a snarl, he snatched a pistol from a fallen Reaper nearby. But he didn't point it at Document. Instead, he turned and shot at the ground near Hackett's feet, sending up a spray of dust. Hackett stumbled, eyes going wide. "Carl, you traitor?" he roared. Carl's face twisted in anguish. "I'm done, boss. This is insane." He fired again, this time at Crusher, who was sprinting up with a rifle. Crusher dropped behind the SUV for cover, shouting obscenities. Doc watched in astonishment as Carl vaulted across the ruined bike and slid into cover near him. "You'd better have a plan to end this," Carl hissed, chest heaving. "I just signed my death warrant." Doc swallowed hard. "If you really want out, help me get Manny's people to stand them down. It's the only way to avoid more killing." Carl peeked over the twisted metal, seeing Hackett rallying the Reapers. "They'll never surrender. They've got too much to lose. And you have no idea how many more might be on the way." Doc clenched his jaw. "Then we need to disable them fast or find a way to scare them off until the sheriff arrives." Carl closed his eyes briefly. "Let's see what we can do." Manny's bold push. On the other side of the fray, Manny and Jeb reloaded behind the Freightliner's hood. Jeb's voice was ragged with adrenaline. "We gotta push, Manny. If we stay pinned, they'll figure out a way around us." Manny gritted his teeth. "I know, but we can't just rush them." Doc, as he glanced up, spotting Doc crouched with Carl. Manny's eyes went wide. "He's free. Looks like he's with one of the bikers." Cynthia popped up, fired a covering shot, then ducked back down. "Maybe the guy switched sides? Either way, we need to exploit it." "Agreed." Manny leaned around the front of the truck, shouted over the gunfire, "Doc, get down. We're moving forward." Doc heard him and signaled back with a wave. Carl fired at a Reaper who tried to flank them. The man went down with a shout, dropping his weapon. The Reaper's formation was splintering under the surprise defection and Manny's determined push. Seeing the Reapers falter, Manny gestured to Jeb and a few others. "Advance on the left side. Keep spaced out. We've got to push them back." A group of Manny's allies emerged from behind the rigs, rifles at the ready. They moved in a loose line, taking cover behind random desert obstacles. Bullets zinged past. One ally, a bearded trucker named Dwight, took a grazing shot to the arm. He winced but stayed upright, returning fire. Hackett's fury. Hackett saw the tide turning. His men were pinned between Manny's advancing line and the looming possibility of law enforcement arriving. Gritting his teeth, he waved Crusher and Rhino over. "We're not going down like this," he snarled. "We'll break their line, grab the dock, and regroup. If we can't get the guns, we'll torch him, no evidence left." Crusher frowned, glancing at the battered box truck. "They're half-loaded in the truck. We can't just leave them." Hackett leveled a glare that brooked no argument. "Shut up and follow me." They ducked around the SUV's rear, ignoring a wounded Reaper who clutched his leg. Hackett fired a few suppressing shots to keep Manny's group from advancing too quickly. Then, in a lightning move, they sprinted toward Carl and Doc's position, weaving through the swirling dust. Carl spotted them. "Incoming. The boss is making a beeline for us." Doc's stomach lurched. Hackett wouldn't hesitate to kill them both now, Carl for treason, Doc for being a liability. "We have to move," Doc yelled. "This cover won't hold if they flank us." Carl nodded, reloading his pistol with shaky hands. "Go. I'll hold them off." Doc hesitated. "Alone?" Carl gave a grim smile. "If I run with you, they'll pick us off easier. Besides, it's my fight now." Before Doc could protest, Carl popped over the wreckage, firing at the onrushing Reapers. Doc scrambled away, staying low. Gunfire roared on both sides. As he reached Manny's position, Manny ducked out to grab his arm, pulling him behind the Freightliner. Cynthia, Jeb, and the others encircled them, eyes darting for more threats. Manny's voice was tight with concern. "Doc, you okay?" Doc swallowed, blinking dust from his eyes. "I'm fine, mostly. That biker, Carl, he turned on them. He's helping us." Jeb spat. He's got guts. But Hackett's not backing down. Cynthia reloaded, sweat streaking her face. The sheriff better get here soon or we'll run out of ammo. Doc peered through a gap in the Freightliner's front wheel well. Carl was engaged in a furious exchange of bullets with Hackett's crew. The dust and muzzle flashes made it hard to see. A bullet pinged off the metal, nearly hitting Carl. He ducked behind the twisted remains of a Reaper bike. Rhino advanced on Carl's flank, clutching his bandaged shoulder. Doc's heart pounded. I can't let Carl face them alone. He's giving us a chance. The sheriff's arrival. Suddenly, from the far side of the highway, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights danced across the dusty battlefield. 2 sheriff's department SUVs barreled onto the scene, tires squealing, scattering clouds of grit. Deputies in tan uniforms spilled out, weapons drawn. One deputy used a bullhorn, voice cracking. Drop your weapons. This is the county sheriff's department. Drop your weapons now. For an instant, everyone froze. Manny's allies exchanged relieved glances. Hackett's men, caught in the open, looked to their leader for direction. Hackett's eyes blazed with hatred. We're not done, he spat. But the sirens multiplied. More patrol vehicles screeched to a halt on the road's shoulder. Deputies fanned out, forming a practiced perimeter. Over the bullhorn, the command repeated, drop your weapons, or we will use lethal force. A few of the Reapers, battered and low on ammo, seemed ready to surrender. They lowered their guns, hands rising. Crusher, though, bellowed, I ain't giving up. He fired at one of the sheriff's vehicles, cracking the windshield. The deputies opened fire, returning the shot. Crusher dove, bullets punching into the dirt around him. Rhino let out a roar of frustration, raising his rifle. But Carl, battered and bloodied, emerged from the dust behind him. He pressed his pistol to Rhino's back and growled, drop it, Rhino. It's over. Rhino hesitated, then let his rifle slip from his hands. He collapsed to his knees, exhaustion and pain overtaking him. Hackett, still near the battered box truck, glared at Carl, betrayal etched on his face. But with sirens closing in and more deputies arriving by the second, his bravado faltered. At last, he hurled his pistol aside, hands slowly going up. The battle ended in a ragged hush. Sheriff Walden himself, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, strode forward, weapon drawn, scanning for any last threats. Manny's crew stepped back, weapons lowered, letting the law take control. Deputies swarmed the area, disarming the remaining Reapers, cuffing them. A paramedic team arrived minutes later in a separate vehicle, racing to treat the wounded. Aftermath. Doc sank to the asphalt, leaning against Manny's Freightliner. Cynthia knelt beside him, checking his cuts and bruises. You're a mess, she said gently. He gave a hoarse chuckle. Feels that way. I'll live. Manny stood a few feet away, speaking to Sheriff Walden, gesturing at the captured Reapers. Walden kept glancing at Doc, possibly remembering Manny's calls about the missing trucker. Meanwhile, Jeb and some of the other volunteer truckers were assisting the paramedics in tending to injured Reapers. Doc's sense of relief mingled with deep fatigue. A group of deputies corralled the disarmed bikers, forcing them to kneel on the road's shoulder. Hackett was among them, his braided beard caked with dust, eyes smoldering with venom. Crusher, shot in the leg, was hauled to an ambulance. Rhino hobbled off to be treated, staring daggers at Carl the entire time. Carl stood alone, pistol lowered at his side. He hadn't approached the deputies or Manny's group. Blood trickled down his cheek and fresh bruises discolored his jaw. Several Reapers shouted curses at him, calling him a traitor. Doc mustered the strength to push himself upright. I need to check on him, he told Cynthia. She nodded, too tired to protest. Doc limped over to Carl, who tensed as he approached. Hey, Doc said softly. You okay? Carl exhaled shakily. I'm alive. For now. He glanced at the armed deputies. I just shot my former brothers. The law will lock me up or they'll assume I'm with them. His voice cracked a bit. I don't belong anywhere. Doc studied Carl's face, a swirl of regret, relief, and fear. He recognized the weight of severing ties with one's past, however dark. We'll tell them you helped us, Doc said. You saved lives today. That counts for something. Carl barked a bitter laugh. I've done a lot of bad things, Doc, you meant. Not sure if one good deed can wipe that slate clean. Doc reached out, resting a hand on Carl's shoulder. Maybe not, but it's a start. He offered a faint, earnest smile. I believe in second chances. Carl's expression wavered. Then he handed the pistol to Doc, handle first. Then you'd better take this. I doubt the deputies will be thrilled if I'm still armed. Doc nodded, carefully accepting the gun. Then he motioned one of the deputies over. The deputy, face tense, approached warily. Doc raised his empty hand. He helped me escape, Doc said quietly. He turned on the Reapers, saved lives. I'll vouch for him. Carl lowered his head, bracing for cuffs. The deputy glanced between them, then nodded. All right? We'll sort it out at the station. Hands on your head, though. Carl complied, letting the deputy pat him down and place plastic restraints on his wrists. He didn't resist, just stared off into the dusty horizon. A reunion. Manny arrived as Carl was taken aside. He wrapped Doc in a fierce embrace, tears glistening. I thought we lost you, kid. Doc managed a shaky laugh. You nearly did. You saved me and saved Golden Valley. He rubbed a bruise on his arm, wincing. Thank you. Cynthia joined them, patting Doc's back. Jeb ambled over, wiping sweat from his brow. Hell of a morning, he said, voice wry. Could have gone worse. Doc nodded. It very nearly did. They turned to watch deputies load Hackett and the other Reapers into patrol SUVs. The battered box truck, riddled with bullet holes, sat half-jammed in a ditch. Crates of illegal firearms were stacked on the roadside, being inventoried by the sheriff's men. The dawn sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene of dust, scattered vehicles, spent shell casings, and wounded men receiving care. Cynthia eyed Doc's torn shirt and bleeding brow. We'd better get you checked out, document. He exhaled, exhaustion washing over him. Yeah, that'd be good. In the sheriff's care. By mid-morning, the scene was under control. Ambulances transported the severely wounded, both Reapers and a couple of Manny's crew who'd sustained minor gunshot wounds. Doc insisted on walking under his own power, ignoring the medic's scolding looks until they finally coaxed him into letting them clean his cuts. Sheriff Walden approached Doc and Manny near the ambulance. Walden's eyes were somber, voice gravelly. We'll need statements from all of you. This was quite the operation. We've been tracking the Reapers for a while, but never had enough evidence to move on them. You just handed us a treasure trove of illegal firearms and captured the crew's leadership. Manny puffed out a weary breath. Glad we could help, but we sure didn't plan on a firefight. Doc leaned against the ambulance fender. What'll happen to Carl, the one who turned on them? Walden pursed his lips. He's not off the hook. Likely he's got charges pending if he was involved in other Reaper crimes. But your testimony about his role here might sway a judge. The sheriff paused, shaking his head. He's cooperating with us so far, giving statements about the Reaper's operations. Could be a big break. Doc nodded, relief flickering. At least Carl won't vanish into some bureaucratic black hole. He hoped the man would see a chance for redemption. Return to Golden Valley. By midday, Manny, Cynthia, Doc, and the rest of the volunteer truckers headed back to Golden Valley truck stop, some on foot, escorted by friendly drivers, others crammed into the remaining vehicles. Manny's Freightliner had sustained bullet holes and a cracked windshield, but it was drivable. The road felt eerily quiet after the chaos of the morning. Doc sat in Manny's passenger seat, lulled by the engine's steady rumble. The pain in his ribs and face was persistent but overshadowed by the surreal relief of being free. The sheriff's department remained behind to process the scene, but Manny's group was allowed to go after providing initial statements. Additional paperwork and interviews would follow, but for now they were free to return to their lives. As they pulled into Golden Valley, the familiar blinking sign felt like a beacon of normalcy. Drivers from distant states lounged near the rigs, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded miles away. Rosie stood in front of the roadside spoon, craning her neck anxiously. The moment she spotted Manny's convoy, she rushed forward, tears in her eyes. Doc climbed down, grimacing at a sore knee, and Rosie threw her arms around him, sobbing with relief. "You're alive," she murmured. "I was so scared." He patted her back gently, his own eyes threatening to water. "I made it back, Rosie. Thanks to all of you. You all saved me." She held him at arm's length, scanning his bruised face. "You look like you went through a meat grinder." Doc gave a tired smile. "Feel that way, too." Quiet celebration. That evening, after a whirlwind of nervous conversation and relief, Manny insisted they all gather in the diner for a warm meal. Cynthia, Jeb, and the other truckers who joined the rescue lined the booths. Rosie bustled about, pushing fresh coffee and plates of hot food on everyone on the house, she insisted. Word spread quickly among the truckers who stopped in, each marveling at the story: a showdown with the Reapers, a rescue in the desert, and a heroic stand to protect the truck stop. Some raised mugs in quiet tribute to Doc, Manny, and their allies. Doc, bandages on his brow and arms, sipped his coffee. His gaze drifted across the room. He saw Manny leaning over to share a joke with Jeb, who roared with laughter. He saw Cynthia, arm in a sling from a stray piece of shrapnel, wincing as she tried to cut her steak but smiling when another driver helped. He saw Rosie wiping a tear from her cheek, hugging a local driver who kept patting her on the back. A swirl of emotions coursed through him: gratitude, exhaustion, sorrow for the violence, pride in how they'd stood together. But beneath it all, a quiet sense of belonging. This is my community, he thought. They risked their lives to save me and to protect each other. Fallout in future. In the days that followed, the sheriff's department took formal statements from everyone involved. The Reapers who survived faced a host of federal gun-running charges. Carl's fate remained uncertain, but preliminary reports suggested he was cooperating extensively, hoping for leniency. Golden Valley Truck Stop became a local legend. Truckers passing through asked for the blow-by-blow story, enthralled by tales of how a group of ordinary drivers stood up to a biker gang. Rosie's diner filled with quiet pride, but the people who'd lived it, Doc, Manny, Cynthia, Jeb, were more than happy to let the tale fade. Violence, while sometimes necessary, left its mark. They wanted peace again. Doc tried to settle back into routine. He took short hauls, healing from his injuries, passing the nights in his rig's bunk. Sometimes the old nightmares from his army days returned, now laced with images of the desert firefight. He'd wake, heart-pounding, reminding himself he was safe. At least I was able to save some lives this time, too. Every so often, Manny or Cynthia would ask about Carl. Doc told them what he knew. Carl had a court date pending and was likely to serve some time. But there was talk of protective custody, maybe a chance for a lighter sentence. Doc had written a statement affirming Carl's critical help, hoping it might tip the scales. Everyone deserves a shot at redemption if they truly want it. Epilogue and a new beginning. Summer rolled on. The sun remained merciless by day, but inside the roadside spoon, a new sense of camaraderie shone brighter. Drivers from all over came to share stories, savor the famous chili, and offer thanks to the truck stop that had proved, beyond doubt, that truckers looked after their own. One afternoon, as the temperature soared outside, Doc found a quiet booth by the diner's window. The smell of chili wafted from the kitchen, and the air conditioner hummed overhead. He sipped iced tea, gazing out at a line of rigs glinting in the sun. Rosie approached, a broad smile on her face. "Refill?" she asked, gesturing with the pitcher. Doc nodded. "Sure." He noticed how her worry lines had softened since that fateful day. Life had found a rhythm again. She poured more tea, then set the pitcher down, leaning in confidentially. "Heard from Manny you might be thinking of staying around here more, maybe working locally so you're not always on the road." Doc shrugged, swirling the ice in his glass. "The open highway still calls. But yeah, I've been thinking. This place feels like home in a way I haven't felt anywhere else for a long time." Rosie patted his shoulder. "We'd sure love to have you around. You've helped a lot of people document." She paused. "Sometimes I think people like you don't realize how much good you do just by being here." Doc looked away, moved by her words. "Well, I owe all of you too. You saved my life." Rosie's eyes glistened. "We protect our own." She cleared her throat, stepping back with a warm smile. "Enjoy your tea." As Rosie left, Doc gazed out the window again. A battered pickup rumbled into the lot, brakes squealing. A nervous-looking driver hopped out, presumably new to Golden Valley. Doc imagined greeting him, offering advice. That sense of belonging, maybe that's what I've been missing. He remembered that final moment in the desert, kneeling in the dust, heart-hammering, when Manny hauled him up and held on like a father. Family doesn't have to be blood. That truth felt more certain now than ever. A busboy hurried past, stacking dishes with a clatter. The neon sign flickered overhead: Golden Valley Truck Stop, stay a while, friend. A simple invitation, yet it had become the rallying cry of a community that defied danger and stood united. Doc let out a long breath. The road would still beckon, sure enough. But at least now he knew he had a place to come back to, a place where even the most hardened driver or war-weary medic could find kinship and a hot meal. And if trouble ever dared roll into Golden Valley again. Doc placed his empty glass on the table, that old soldier's resolve stirring quietly in his chest. They might learn the hard way, truckers take care of their own.